Robb Stark stood upon the battlements of Moat Cailin at the edge of the swamps, the humid air clinging to him like a second skin. The ancient fortress, though half-ruined, still exuded an air of brooding power. Broad-shouldered and solemn, the young wolf looked out over the marshlands and listened to the quiet that stretched across the distance. There had been ravens and rumors, talk of open rebellion from the Iron Islands, of Balon Greyjoy proclaiming himself king of the Isles. This night, however, brought no clash of steel nor roar of warhorn, only the faint buzz of insects in the darkness and the low murmur of sentries above and below. But Robb had not come here idly. He'd come to meet Theon Greyjoy, a man he had once called friend and brother, to settle a matter that might change the course of the war forever. When Theon arrived, the hour was late, and the moon hung pale and thin overhead, as though reluctant to witness what was about to transpire. His cloak dripped with marsh water, and splatters of mud clung to his boots. He gave Robb a low bow, but his gray eyes were quick and full of something close to defiance. Or perhaps it was hope, Robb thought. The boy he had known at Winterfell had always walked a thin line between arrogance and eagerness, a proud youth determined to seize every advantage he could. But that night, Theon's posture was a little more careful, his voice a little more subdued. "We haven't much time," Theon said, wiping his hands on his breeches, leaving wet patches upon the dark cloth. "My father grows impatient. He's been raiding the western coasts. Small towns, fishing hamlets, nothing the crown or the Lannisters will lament too greatly. But Balon has bigger ambitions. He sees the war in the south as our chance to grab as many prizes as we can before the realm settles into a new shape." Robb surveyed him carefully. "You'll remember that in the north, we do not take kindly to raiders, nor do we appreciate threats to our people or our territory. The Ironborn have a fearsome reputation, Theon, one that makes me wary of extending my hand." A flash of conflict flickered across Theon's face. "You know me, Robb. You know how I was raised. I served your house loyally. The Greyjoy name carries weight on the seas. If my father can be convinced or compelled to align with the North rather than war against it, we could strangle the Lannisters from both land and sea. The West is vulnerable. Lannisport sits ripe for the taking, its harbor deep and rich with merchant cogs fattened on gold. If father is to be crowned king of the Isles, perhaps the cost of that crown is alliance. You named yourself king in the north, Robb. Maybe he'll acknowledge that. Maybe we could do something different." He paused, gathering his words carefully. "You give my father what he wants, recognition of the Iron Islands as sovereign, or at least to let him keep his illusions of sovereignty. And in return, the Iron Fleet is yours. We cut off Casterly Rock by sea, choke their trade lanes, and you move your armies west. You've proven you can outmaneuver the Lannisters on land. Once we have the Westerlands bending the knee, the gold mines and ports will fund your war against the Iron Throne. My father wants only to raid to take spoils. But if I can make him see that allying with you is better than war on two fronts." Robb felt the slow, relentless pounding of his heart, as though each beat hammered out a new set of possibilities. "You would be asking me to sanction your father's rebellion, to acknowledge him as king of the Iron Islands, or at least to let him have his style and your drowned priests can do what they like. My bannermen will bristle. They've never forgiven your people for the last rebellion, and they won't soon forget. But if this alliance helps us break the Lannisters, perhaps they'll come to understand necessity." Theon lowered his voice. "I've risked much sneaking here, Robb. I told my father I wanted to treat with you. You know how precarious my position is. But my father sees in me a chance to bind old blood feuds into something profitable. He sees a chance to use me, his last living son with the cunning to parley with the wolves he once defied. I can keep him in check, but I need you to trust me. Let me be the bridge between the Iron Islands and the North." Robb's stark gray eyes narrowed, searching Theon's face. Theon had indeed been raised among the Starks, something between ward and hostage, shaped by Winterfell's godswood and the stern hand of Eddard Stark. Yet beneath that upbringing lay the watery hearth of Pike. The sea still called to him, and the drumbeat of the Iron Fleet echoed in his veins. To trust Theon, To trust that Theon could sway Balon Greyjoy's ambition could lead either to the North's salvation or downfall. But necessity was a cruel mother. Already Tywin Lannister raised fresh levies in the west, and the realm convulsed under King Joffrey's rule in King's Landing. Renly Baratheon mustered in the Reach, and Stannis on Dragonstone. If Robb was to strike at the heart of Lannister power, the Westerlands beckoned. But without naval support, the cost would be steep. Sieges of Lannisport, vulnerable supply lines along the coasts, the risk of his invasion faltering if the Lannisters brought their fleet down from the Arbor or formed alliances of their own. Robb crossed his arms. In the gloom of Moat Caelin's towers, the torchlight painted him in streaks of shadow and gold. Very well. Bring me your father's word. Bring me a pledge that the Iron Fleet will be at my command until the Westerlands fall. In exchange, I will grant the Iron Islands a measure of freedom, though that means my bannermen are sure to protest. But we do what we must. The war is larger than any one man's pride. Let us show the realm that the young wolf and the Ironborn can strike a bargain the Lannisters will never see coming. Theon inclined his head, and relief washed across his features as though a great weight had lifted from his shoulders. You won't regret this, he whispered. No one's ever marched on the Westerlands with the Iron Fleet at their side. Not in living memory. The following days were filled with negotiation. Coded letters sent by Raven, secret conferences between Theon and Balon's captains. News came that Balon Greyjoy had indeed crowned himself upon the Seastone chair and proclaimed the old ways of reaving returned to the Iron Islands. Yet there was talk in Pike that the old Kraken looked out upon the sea and saw an opportunity. The Lannisters' war was not yet fully joined in the west, with Tywin abroad in the Riverlands, King Joffrey holding court in King's Landing, and many a lord uncertain where to turn. Boldness would be rewarded, Balon seemed to believe, and if forging an alliance with the North meant he'd have the chance to strike Lannisport from the waves, so be it. When the pact was settled, Robb agreeing to recognize the Iron Islands as a free and sovereign kingdom upon the war's successful conclusion, Balon sent word that his fleet would sail. Robb, in turn, recalled his bannermen from the Riverlands, commanding Catelyn to remain behind with the remnants of the northern host that guarded the Twins. He prepared the bulk of his forces for a swift march along the coast. Their aim, to strike at the Westerlands from an unexpected direction. They would meet in the harbor outside Case, a smaller port city overshadowed by Lannisport but close enough to threaten it. It was a gamble and Robb knew it. One misstep would set the North at odds with the Ironborn in a fresh wave of bloodshed. But he had made his choice, pinned his hopes on the loyalty Theon claimed to offer. Sometimes, Robb thought of his father, Eddard Stark, how he had always said that honor weighed heavier than a crown. Ned Stark would have frowned upon forging ties with those who raided and burned the shores of the North in living memory. But war made strange bedfellows, and the threat of Lannister power overshadowed the entire realm. If they did nothing, the gold of Casterly Rock would buy swords enough to bury them all. They marched. The weather favored them with cool breezes blowing in from the west. The army was not the largest the North could muster, but it was a hardened force. Stout men from the plains of the Neck, lords sworn to the Wolfswood, carters and spearmen from the stony coasts beyond Torrhen's Square. Rickard Karstark rode at Robb's side with a grim determination, glancing at Theon from time to time. Lord Bolton was conspicuous in his silence, his pale eyes measuring every exchange. It was no secret that Roose Bolton had misgivings, but for now he followed Robb's command. Others, like the Great John, were openly skeptical, but the prospect of crushing Lannister might overcome their reservations. Dacy Mormont, carrying the spirit of the Bear Isle, spoke openly. If the Ironborn can help us carve out victory, let them. We'll kill them later if they betray us. That was the kind of ruthless logic the times demanded. Word traveled swiftly over land that a great host was approaching, though it appeared headed further down the western coast. Tywin Lannister, typically so well informed, expected any serious threat to come from the Riverlands, for that was where Robb had so thoroughly outfoxed him before, scattering Lannister outriders and seizing the initiative. Tywin's forces remained concentrated in Harrenhal and around the Golden Tooth, prepared for further skirmishes in the Riverlands. He had hardly considered the possibility that the young wolf might strike his own homeland. But that was precisely what Robb intended. When the Northmen reached Case, a wide bay with stony beaches and a fortress perched on a rocky promontory, they found the Iron Fleet already waiting, sails black in the early morning sun. Theon rowed ahead to meet them by the shoreline as rowboats slid onto the sand. Balon Greyjoy himself had not come. He remained on Pike, guarding the seat of his newly claimed kingship. Instead, he had sent his brother Victarion, a mountain of a man with arms like iron bars and eyes as cold as the deep ocean. Aboard the Iron Victory, Victarion stood on the prow in battered plate, the prow shaped like a kraken's head. With him came his best captains, Dagmar Cleftjaw, Ralph the Limper, and others more savage yet. They lined up on the pebbled beach, gazing with wary curiosity at the array of Northmen. Theon moved quickly among them, exchanging words, clasping arms in greeting. Robb found Victarion as intimidating as rumor suggested. He was not eloquent, but he possessed a blunt directness that reminded Robb of his bannermen. "My brother says we sail when you command, Wolf King," he said, his voice rolling like distant thunder. "We are here to feed on the gold of the West. Lannisport is ours to take, if your men know how to strike from land while we strike from sea." Robb nodded. "We'll make for Faircastle first. If we can capture that fortress, it provides a staging ground. Then you'll sail south along the coast, raiding as you go, to draw out any Lannister navy from the port. Once they meet you, we'll slip through the passes and take Lannisport from the rear. Your longships can seal off the harbor. Then all that gold is ours." Victarion bared his teeth in what might have been a grin. "So be it. The drowned god will judge us." They sealed the arrangement with a Spartan meal of hard bread and salted cod, watched by the uneasy eyes of northern lords and ironborn captains alike. But once the strategy was decided, the combined force lost no time. Theon returned to the fleet alongside Victarion, a cocksure smile on his face, eager to prove himself a son of Pike with cunning worthy of the North's trust. Robb prayed Theon's confidence was well-founded. The next few weeks proved the gambit's worth. With the Iron Fleet riding the waves off the western coast, Lannister supply ships were seized or burned. Fishing villages that swore fealty to Casterly Rock were raided and forced to bend to the new alliance of Wolf and Kraken. The Northmen, meanwhile, struck inland. Lords in the Westerlands scrambled to mount a defense, but Tywin's main host was still away, and most of the local garrisons were small. Ser Adam Marbrand, commanding a modest cavalry force, attempted to harass the invaders, but was himself caught in a trap laid by Robb near the edges of the crag. Theon's Ironborn cut off Marbrand's line of retreat to the sea while Greatjon Umber smashed into his flank with axes and war cries. It was a brief but savage fight. Marbrand escaped, but half his men were lost. News spread with the speed of a brushfire. The young wolf had come to the Westerlands, allied to the Iron Islands. A kind of anxious disbelief took hold of lords sworn to Casterly Rock. Their gold was their pride, their fortresses famously well defended, but they had never expected the combined fury of two peoples known for their ferocity. The old arrogance, "No one dares challenge the rock on its own land," began to falter. Faircastle fell without a single assault on its walls. Lord Farman, young and faced with an unthinkable crisis, surrendered at the threat of having the Iron Fleet shell the fortress from the harbor. Robb accepted his yield, posting Northmen to maintain order while Theon's captains seized the local fishing vessels. The show of mercy heartened some among the Westerlands who feared a typical Ironborn spree of brutality, but Robb insisted on discipline. There would be no widespread raping or looting beyond the necessities of war. "We have come to break the Lannisters, not to become them," he said. And though some of his men muttered that Ironborn would do as they pleased, the king in the north made sure his own bannermen upheld the laws of war as best they could. With Faircastle secured, the road to Lannisport lay open if they could move quickly. Scouts confirmed that the Lannister fleet, composed mostly of merchant galleys hastily armed, plus a handful of warships once used to protect trade, had been gathering at Lannisport in case the war came to their shores. But the Lannisters never anticipated the speed and coordination of a North Iron Islands force. Soon, Victarion took half the Iron Fleet southward to lurk near Banefort, poised to sweep down upon any Lannister ships that tried to escape. Meanwhile, Robb's host marched inland, capturing the Banefort castle after a sharp siege of only 3 days. They had surprise on their side, and the Westerlands lords found themselves outmaneuvered. The local defenders, lacking Tywin's leadership and reinforcements, broke under the combined onslaught of Northmen and Ironborn. Terror seized the local populace. Wolves and krakens marched together, a monstrous union that spelled doom for the proud lion of House Lannister. And though the young wolf's conditions for surrender were fairer than the average warlord's, the presence of the Ironborn was enough to send villagers fleeing into the hills. Some took up arms in small pockets of resistance, launching ambushes that killed stragglers. But overall, the unstoppable momentum of the invasion rolled forward. Word reached King's Landing of this shocking alliance. Queen Regent Cersei Lannister is said to have flown into a rage, smashing an ornate glass of arbor gold across the throne room floor. She demanded that her father Tywin march west at once. Tywin, for his part, was forced to lift his hold on Harrenhal and break off with half his men to ride for the Westerlands. But travel from the Riverlands to the west would take precious time, and in that time, Robb Stark made every day count. Near the dusty crossroad that led to the Golden Road, the Northmen overcame a Lannister rearguard commanded by a minor cousin of the family, Ser Devon Lannister. Here, Robb displayed that cunning that had earned him the respect of older generals. He staged a feint, drawing Devon's knights into an open field, then revealed the presence of heavy cavalry concealed in a nearby copse of trees. The Lannisters, outflanked, tried to fall back toward their fortifications, but Theon's men, who had disembarked at a rocky cove further down the shore, cut off their retreat. A swirling melee ensued. By evening's end, Devon Lannister and a score of his knights were captured. Others drowned trying to escape to the sea. That victory set the tone for the next surge forward. Aware that time was not on his side, Tywin's wrath would soon descend. Robb pressed for Lannisport with renewed vigor. He sent outriders to sever lines of communication, had the Ironborn destroy the beacon towers along the coast so that no signals could be lit to warn the city in time. In the gloom of a gray dawn, the combined host arrived on the outskirts of Lannisport. Rows of vineyards and estates led down to the great harbor, which was rimmed by formidable walls. Above it all rose Casterly Rock itself, seat of House Lannister. The plan, swift and bold, hinged on the Iron Fleet. Victarion's ships circled out in the bay, sails furled under the morning fog, waiting for the signal. On land, Theon led a contingent of Ironborn reavers, accompanied by several hundred seasoned Northmen. Their mission was to infiltrate along the edges of the harbor, where the city's walls were weaker near the docks. They carried ropes, grapnels, and the ruthless cunning of men who had sacked many a coastal village. Meanwhile, Robb personally commanded the main assault from the eastern gate, hoping to draw the attention of the defenders there. When the attack began, Lannisport's defenders were unprepared for the ferocity. Horns and drums thundered as the young wolf's men poured forth, smashing against the city's gates with rams and siege towers. Archers on the walls rained arrows down, felling men left and right, but the momentum carried the Northmen forward. Ser Edmure Tully had arrived just in time with a small Riverrun contingent, linking up with Robb's force. Their fresh crossbowmen exchanged lethal volleys with the defenders above. Meanwhile, Theon's group scaled the walls near the docks, quickly overwhelming the small guard posted there. Then through the gates open to the wharf, a ripple of alarm spread through the city. The enemy was inside the walls. Chaos reigned in Lannisport as Theon's Ironborn loosed war cries and brandished axes, cutting down Lannister men-at-arms. They quickly seized the harbor fortifications, and that was the cue for Victarion's Iron Fleet to row in under full sail. Ramming the small Lannister war galleys moored there, they burned the merchant cogs in short order, black smoke billowing high into the morning sky. Fisherfolk and merchants fled the quays in terror, screaming that demons had emerged from the fog. Inside the city, Robb breached the main gate after an hour of brutal fighting. The Great John was the first through, and the savage impetus of House Umber's charge sent the defenders reeling. Robb and his direwolf, Grey Wind, pressed on through the swirling melee, hoping to reach the central square where the city's leadership might be organizing a defense. But the defenders were no cowards. Lannisport was a large city, home to many well-trained men sworn to the Lannisters. They barricaded streets, fired ballista bolts from towers. The fighting turned bloody, house to house, block by block, with screams echoing over the clash of steel and the roar of flames. Civilians fled in droves, some cowering in temples, others risking the city gates now under partial control by the North. Women and children sobbed behind locked doors, praying the tide of war would pass them by. At midday, a group of Lannister reinforcements from the Rock swept out to challenge the invaders. Led by Kevan Lannister, they were tough veterans who had served under Tywin in prior campaigns. The clash in the city square was fierce, and Robb personally unhorsed a knight from House Brax with a savage swing of his sword. Grey Wind darted among the fallen, snarling and snapping at those who threatened his master. For a moment, the momentum seemed uncertain. But then Theon arrived with the Ironborn, flanking the Lannisters from a side alley. The presence of reaving krakens unnerved Kevan's men. Shouts rang out, "The wolves and krakens fight as one!" And fear claimed the defenders. One by one, they fell or surrendered, and Kevan Lannister himself, wounded and bleeding, was taken prisoner. With their local commander gone, the city's resistance crumbled. By dusk, the banners of the dire wolf and the kraken flew side by side over Lannisport's ramparts. Exhausted, blood-stained, victorious, Robb Stark stood in the battered main square, Grey Wind panting by his side. Bodies lay strewn along the cobblestones, and fires still smoldered among the wharf district. Northmen and Ironborn alike were pillaging certain quarters, though the worst atrocities were reined in by strict orders. The city's leaders, pale and trembling, knelt before the young wolf. "Spare us, my lord, please," they pleaded. We yield. Robb accepted their surrender but made it clear that any further resistance would be met with harsh reprisals. By capturing Lannisport, Robb had gained an invaluable stronghold. This was not just a symbolic victory. The city's wealth, ships, and position as the gateway to Casterly Rock made it the beating heart of Lannister power in the region. Now that heart was in the hands of wolves and krakens. Soldiers cheered in the streets, flush with triumph, though many wept for lost friends. Victarion Greyjoy prowled the harbor, overseeing the final seizure of Lannister ships still afloat and ensuring the city's port was locked down. Theon marched triumphantly, as though a man reborn. No longer the uncertain ward, he now strutted with a new sense of identity, forging a place where Pike and Winterfell might stand side by side. However, Casterly Rock itself still loomed to the north of the city. The seat of House Lannister was carved from the ancient rock face, rumored to be impregnable. High ramparts, hidden passages, storied defenses that had repelled countless sieges over centuries. With Tywin's forces en route, Robb could not afford a long siege if he meant to hold Lannisport. He needed to consider his next move carefully. Theon urged a bold strike from the sea, perhaps landing Ironborn at the base of the rock. But it was said that the rock had hidden sea caves that could devour entire ships with treacherous currents. Victarion preferred to starve the rock out, blockading it by sea and letting the Northmen handle the inland approach. In the days following the capture of Lannisport, the city was put to uneasy order. Robb set up a command post in the large keep that overlooked the harbor, replacing the Lannister garrison with a mix of Northmen and Ironborn. There were tensions between the allies. Some Ironborn complained that the Northmen were too gentle with the conquered city, forbidding them from reaving as they wished. Conversely, many of Robb's lords eyed the Ironborn as untrustworthy cutthroats, especially after hearing rumors of atrocities on smaller coasts. But Theon served as a bridge between them, soothing tempers and acting as Robb's envoy to Victarion. They hammered out the terms of the occupation, dividing spoils and ensuring minimal chaos. Soon, news arrived that Tywin had taken the Golden Tooth and was riding hard for Casterly Rock with a formidable host, reported to be nearly 20,000 strong. With him were some of his best commanders. Ser Gregor Clegane, the mountain that rides, as well as the remnants of the Lannister cavalry that had escaped earlier defeats. They came with grim purpose, ready to reclaim Lannisport and punish the upstart king in the north for daring to ravage Lannister lands. Robb convened his war council in the grand hall of Lannisport's keep. There, assembled beneath banners that still smelled of smoke and blood, stood the North's key lords, Karstark, Bolton, the Great John, Mormont, and others, alongside Victarion Greyjoy, Theon Greyjoy, Dagmar Cleftjaw, and a half-dozen Ironborn captains. Maps of the Westerlands were spread out across a heavy oak table. Candlelight flickered across the grim faces of men who knew Tywin's reputation. "He'll strike swiftly," Robb said, tracing the roads on the map with a gauntlet finger. "The rock is too valuable to lose. If he retakes the city, we lose our stronghold and our supply route. The Iron Fleet will have to pull back or risk being bottled up in the harbor. Our best chance is to meet him in the field before he reaches Casterly Rock. Force a pitched battle." Bolton's soft voice cut through the tension. "A pitched battle against Tywin Lannister is a hazardous proposition. We have taken him by surprise thus far, but in an open field, he may well best us through numbers and cunning." The Great John let out a booming laugh. "Cunning? We've bested him before, haven't we? Let him come. My men grow restless sitting on their haunches in this city. We can give him a proper fight." Victarion stood, arms folded, his face like carved granite. "We cannot sail our ships onto dry land, but the drowned god is with us. If you meet Tywin in the field, we can harry his forces from the coastline, perhaps land raiders behind him, disrupt his lines. We know these waters well enough now." Roose Bolton's thin lips curved in a ghostly smile. "That may be wise. Force him to choose between continuing forward or turning to face the Ironborn landing behind him." Theon leaned over the table. "If we can draw his vanguard into an ambush, carve it up, Tywin will have to slow his advance. That could buy us time to prepare Lannisport's defenses if a larger battle is unavoidable." Robb nodded, staring at the map. Each path bristled with risk. He recalled his father's stories of the last time the North had marched so far south, how easily fortunes could turn. But the victory in Lannisport had emboldened him and his men. He could not simply hand back the city, and if he allowed Tywin to besiege him here with the rock nearby, the Lannisters might coordinate a crushing double strike. Best to fight on ground of his choosing. In the end, he chose a location just north of the city, where rolling plains gave way to low hills, good terrain to position archers and cavalry. A swift messenger was sent to Tywin, challenging him to meet the king in the north in open combat. Whether Tywin would take the bait or not, no one could say, but the Lannisters were not known to back away from confronting a declared foe, especially on their own land. The days that followed were tense. Robb ordered the city's defenses bolstered. Walls were repaired, the harbor filled with chain booms to prevent any surprise from the sea, though that was unlikely. Civilians milled about in fear, uncertain whether they should remain under foreign occupation or flee deeper inland. Theon worked tirelessly to coordinate the Iron Fleet with the land forces. He had never looked so alive. This was his element: sea raids and cunning maneuvers. Sometimes Robb watched Theon with a distant sadness, remembering the boy who had shared jokes in the Great Hall of Winterfell. Now they were men immersed in blood and ambition. Tywin arrived in the region sooner than expected. His outriders exchanged skirmishes with Robb's scouts. By the time the two forces finally faced each other, the tension in the air was palpable. Robb's men assembled in a wide valley, flanked by a gently winding stream. He placed his cavalry on the wings, archers along the slopes, and Theon's small group of Ironborn, those who fought on foot, on the left flank under Dagmar Cleftjaw's harsh command. Opposite them, the Lannister host stretched in disciplined lines, red and gold banners rippling in the breeze. Tywin Lannister himself sat astride a black courser, plate glinting with gold filigree. By his side rode Gregor Clegane and a host of knights in shining mail. For a moment, silence held the field. Robb glanced back at the men behind him. Men with battered shields, sharpened blades, the memory of the victory at Lannisport still burning bright in their hearts. Grey Wind prowled at Robb's side, hackles raised. Tywin lifted a hand, and a war horn sounded. With a single wordless roar, the Lannister lines advanced. The battle was joined in a furious collision of steel. The Lannister center, led by the Mountain, crashed into the North's ranks, scattering men with the sheer brute force of Gregor's charge. Everywhere, swords clanged on shields, men screamed and fell into the grass. Theon's Ironborn, not used to large field battles but savage in close quarters, held the left flank better than expected, cutting down knights who underestimated their ferocity. On the right, the Great John led a wild cavalry charge that shattered a group of Lannister archers, but was soon met by Tywin's heavy horse. The pounding of hooves shook the earth, and the carnage was immediate. Lances breaking, horses screaming, men trampled underfoot. Robb directed the center, rallying his men whenever they threatened to buckle. Again and again, Gregor Clegane's mad brutality threatened to split the North's line wide open, but Lord Rickard Karstark and the Mormont women fought with savage determination, harrying the towering knight from the flanks. Grey Wind tore through unprotected areas, sowing terror among the Lannister foot, forcing them to fight on two fronts. Robb's archers rained arrows upon the Lannisters from the slopes, drawing curses and screams. But Tywin's men were disciplined. They reformed ranks, pressed forward. Hours passed in blood and misery. The summer sun glared overhead, turning the battlefield into a sweltering furnace. The ground became slick with gore. Men slipped, swords clanged. War horses kicked up dust so thick that friend and foe alike coughed and choked. At one point, Robb was unhorsed by a Lannister knight. He parried desperately, Grey Wind launching himself at the knight's horse. The horse reared, the knight toppled, and Robb's sword found his throat in a single swift thrust. The clangor of warfare overwhelmed all else, an endless cacophony of steel and death. Yet the moment Theon's plan came to fruition was when Victarion Greyjoy's landing force, previously hidden along the coast, emerged behind the Lannister lines in a savage flank attack. They had rowed ashore some miles away, circling behind the battlefield. The watchers Tywin had placed to guard his rear never expected an amphibious maneuver so far inland. Suddenly, Tywin found his supply wagons ablaze, his baggage train under assault from hundreds of Ironborn reavers. With alarmed cries, many of his men turned to face this new threat, and discipline frayed. Seeing the confusion, Robb ordered his reserves forward. The Northmen let out a resounding battle cry, forming a wedge that drove into the Lannister center. The Great John and his battered cavalry regrouped and struck from the right. This time, Gregor Clegane was forced to wheel his horse around to fend off the new attacks on multiple fronts. The unstoppable mountain of a man fought like a demon, cutting down two men at a time, but even he could not be everywhere. Tywin tried to rally his troops, cursing at them to hold formation, but the panic of being surrounded set in. Theon's men on the left gave a final push, and the Lannister lines shattered, men fleeing in disarray. In the end, it was a rout. Many Lannisters were cut down in their flight or else taken captive. Tywin himself, gravely wounded by an arrow in the thigh, barely escaped with a small retinue. The mountain also broke free, leaving behind a swath of corpses. The field belonged to Robb Stark, king in the north, and his unlikely allies, the Ironborn. Another legendary victory to burnish the young wolf's growing legend. After the battle, Robb saw to his men, ensuring the wounded were tended, or given mercy if no care could save them. Too many good men had been lost, among them some of his father's oldest friends. Rickard Karstark nursed a deep cut across his brow. The Greyjohn's armor was so dented it looked like scrap metal. Bolton bore new bruises, but they were alive, victorious. Theon swaggered across the field, triumph in his eyes, smirking at the sight of Lannister corpses. He was quick to claim credit for orchestrating the flank assault. Victarion scowled at him, for it was actually Victarion who had handled much of the planning, but in the afterglow of victory, there was little argument. With Tywin in retreat, the Westerlands lay largely defenseless before them. Casterly Rock had closed its gates, raising the famous lion banners in defiance. But with Lannisport under occupation, and the Iron Fleet controlling the seas, the Rock was isolated. Scouts reported that Tywin had retreated toward the Gold Road, possibly intending to regroup or even flee east to King's Landing. That left the seat of Lannister power sealed behind its walls. Robb now faced a daunting question: how to capture Casterly Rock itself. That challenge loomed larger than any they had faced so far. The Rock was said to be unassailable, but Robb also understood the strength of his position. He could starve the fortress, blockade it from both land and sea, while the remainder of the Westerlands collapsed around it. Towns and lesser castles were already surrendering, hoping to avoid the fate of Lannisport. Bargains were struck: fealty to the king in the north, gold tributes paid to the Ironborn in exchange for mercy. Robb took no pleasure in subjugating an entire region, but it was war, and the Lannisters had brought war to his family first. Now, the Wolf and the Kraken had the upper hand. Robb decided to press the advantage. He sent envoys to Casterly Rock, demanding the unconditional surrender of the fortress and the renunciation of Joffrey's claim on the Iron Throne. In return, he offered leniency to any Lannister within who would swear fealty to the North's rightful rule. The answer came back swiftly: defiance. The battered but still proud defenders of the Rock refused to bend the knee, cursing the Wolf King and his Ironborn allies. So began the siege of Casterly Rock, a siege that would become the stuff of songs across the realm. The Ironborn patrolled the sea around the rocky promontory where the castle perched. Their warships scouted for hidden coves and sea caves. On land, Robb's army circled the rock, building palisades and watchtowers, cutting off supply lines. Long months dragged on, full of small skirmishes and clever attempts at infiltration. Lannister archers perched along the rock walls, picking off any unlucky soul who dared come too close. Occasional sally forces attempted to break out, but Robb's men repelled them. The valleys and roads around the rock brimmed with sharpened stakes and entrenched lines. Over time, the defenders inside grew hungry, rationing their stores of grain and salted meat. Amid this prolonged siege, politics simmered. The rest of the realm watched in amazement as Robb Stark dismantled Lannister dominion in the Westerlands. King's Landing was in uproar. Cersei raged, Joffrey sulked on the Iron Throne. Tyrion tried in vain to organize some rescue. The Tyrells weighed whether to remain loyal to the Iron Throne or strike their own bargains. Stannis Baratheon eyed the turmoil hungrily from Dragonstone. The war had become more complicated than ever, but for the moment, the North reigned supreme in the West, and the Ironborn reveled in plunder. Yet, success brought new perils. Balon Greyjoy, flush with the sense that the old way was triumphant, began sending more longships not only to the Westerlands but to northern shores as well, reaving smaller villages and hoarding spoils. Reports reached Robb that the Ironborn in White Harbor had grown restless, that House Manderly was threatening them. Tensions between the North and the Iron Islands flared anew as Ironborn raiders pushed beyond the boundaries Robb had set. Theon tried to rein them in, but the Sea Lords of Pike answered ultimately to Balon, not his son. Robb's own bannermen grumbled at these provocations, reminding him that an alliance with the Ironborn was always risky. Some demanded that he punish the Reavers, or else they would begin to question his leadership. Robb found himself in a precarious position. Without the Iron Fleet, he might lose his stranglehold on the Westerlands. With them, his own domain risked continuing raids and enmity that could not be put back in the bottle. He confronted Theon about it in a dimly lit war room in Lannisport's keep. "You said your father could be managed," Robb growled, frustration evident in his tightened fists. "You said he'd see sense if we acknowledged his kingship." Theon's face was flushed. "I told him that reaving northern coasts would push you away, that it threatened our alliance. Balon does not think like a mainland lord. Raiding is in his blood, in our tradition. It's how he cements his power among the captains. I'm trying to persuade him to keep his men in check, but you must understand, he sees the North as weak, vulnerable. He can't fathom an alliance in the same way you do. I can only promise to do my best." Robb's anger simmered. "Then do better, Theon. The North bleeds while we sit here at the edge of victory. If the Manderleys rise up or the houses of the White Knife decide to withhold men, our cause could be undone. Theon bowed his head, hands trembling slightly. I will make him see. Or Victarion if my father won't listen. I won't betray you, Robb. You have my word. To compound the tension, rumors emerged that Lady Catelyn Stark, left to manage affairs near the twins and Moat Cailin, had begun her own negotiations. She had grown uneasy about the Iron Islands raids and was exploring potential alliances with the forces of Renly Baratheon, who was forging claims to the throne in the Reach. Some said she even considered forming a truce with the Lannisters if it would secure the release of Sansa and Arya, who were still at the mercy of King Joffrey in King's Landing. Despite these swirling undercurrents of doubt, the siege of Casterly Rock continued, unrelenting. Stones were catapulted at the massive walls, but the fortress was scarcely damaged. The defenders, however, were slowly starving. Winter might not be upon them yet, but the rock stocks were finite. Robb devised a final, cunning plan to break their resolve. Through captured Lannister soldiers, he spread the rumor that he intended to assault the rock's hidden sea caves, using black powder purchased from across the narrow sea. A bluff, but an unsettling one. Victarion Greyjoy helped by sending small raiding parties into the maze of sea passages at night, rattling swords and lighting torches, as if mapping them for a larger attack. The tension within Casterly Rock grew day by day. Finally, after countless weeks of encirclement, a white banner was raised atop one of the high towers. Robb rode forward under a flag of truce, flanked by Karstark and the Great John. From within the gates emerged a delegation led by Ser Flemont Brax and a handful of Lannister cousins. Their armor hung loosely on their bodies, faces gaunt with hunger. They knelt before Robb Stark and presented terms. They were willing to yield the castle if guaranteed safe conduct for all within the rock, as well as a pardon for the lesser soldiers. The great families within the walls might have to negotiate separately, but the garrison wanted no more bloodshed. Robb considered their offer. He was mindful that inside those walls might be Lanny, stir women and children. He remembered how his father had taught him that mercy was never a weakness. He also knew that the men of the North might demand vengeance for all the evils done to House Stark. Yet he resolved that mercy, carefully measured, could secure the realm. After conferring with his lords, Robb accepted. Flemont Brax led the keys of the rock to Robb. That evening, the gates were drawn open, and the king in the north entered Casterly Rock with a wary retinue. What they found inside was a place of grand halls and golden tapestries, now overshadowed by the hunger and desperation of war. Noble ladies glared from behind locked doors. Half-starved soldiers averted their eyes. Servants bowed to the new conqueror. The Lannister banners still hung from the walls, but their proud lion seemed a hollow symbol now. Robb placed a garrison there, as well as a contingent of Ironborn led by Dagmar Cleftjaw, determined to hold the fortress from within. He allowed the lesser Lannister family members who surrendered to remain under watch, though any who refused were taken prisoner. There was no sign of Tywin, nor Jaime, nor Cersei. They were out in the wider realm, beyond his reach for the moment. But the rock was his, and with it, he had pried the heart out of House Lannister's power. The realm shook with the impact. The gold mines, the seat of ancient prestige, the centuries-old fortress that none had conquered in living memory, now flown with the dire wolf of Stark and the kraken of Greyjoy. For the first time, the name of Robb Stark was whispered in taverns all across Westeros as a rising power who might well remake the Seven Kingdoms. Still, the victory was bittersweet. The war was far from over. King's Landing remained. Joffrey clutched the Iron Throne. Stannis and Renly bickered over their own claims, and Balon Greyjoy was clearly not content with the territory he already grasped. Days after securing the rock, Robb stood upon a balcony overlooking Lannisport's harbor, where the combined fleets of the North and the Iron Islands bobbed at anchor. He felt the salt breeze on his face. Grey wind lay at his feet, muzzle resting on his massive paws. The city below was quieter now, subdued under occupation. In the distance, he could hear the hammering of smiths forging new weapons for the next campaign, and the shouts of dockworkers loading captured Lannister gold onto waiting ships. A hush fell as Theon approached, "I've just spoken with Victarion," Theon said quietly. "He wants to sail back to Pike soon. He's hungry for fresh raids. Says his men are bored now that the fighting's done here." Robb turned, regarding Theon with a heavy gaze. "There will be more fighting yet. The Lannisters are scattered, but not broken. They'll raise new armies or else they'll buy them. Tywin is cunning, and the King's Landing Court will not sit idle while we hold their gold mines." Theon nodded. "Aye, but Victarion doesn't see that. He sees only the spoils now. He doesn't care about tomorrow's battles unless there's plunder to be had. And my father, I can't promise that he won't do something rash. He's got a taste of victory, and the old way demands more. He might test the North's defenses again." Robb's jaw tightened. "Then see to it he knows we won't tolerate further harm to the North. Remind him that we recognized his kingship so we could stand together, not devour each other's lands." A flicker of pain crossed Theon's features. "I will. But you must know, Robb, I fear Balon sees you as nothing but a temporary ally. This arrangement got him gold, prestige. Now he might want to win back the Iron Islands' old territories along the northern coast. I'll try to convince him otherwise, but he's proud, stubborn. If we push too hard, he might break away from this alliance and strike at us the moment we're distracted." Robb ran a hand through his auburn curls, feeling older than his years. "You've done well, Theon. This victory would not have happened without you. But I fear we've let a kraken into our own waters. The North depends on us to keep them safe, and we must also look to our own future. The Iron Islands are both ally and threat. That's the truth of it." Below them, ironborn sailors were hauling crates of loot aboard a galley. A pair of them bickered, nearly coming to blows before an overseer shouted them down. It was an image of the alliance as a whole, tense, profitable, balanced on a razor's edge. Theon sighed. "I'll sail to Pike if I must, speak to my father face to face, perhaps. But I fear what I might find there. He'll be surrounded by yes-men praising him, telling him the drowned god favors endless reaving." Robb reached out and clasped Theon's shoulder. "I remember the boy who was my friend. I know you'll do what you can. For now, let us secure what we've taken here. We have the rock, the city, the gold. We have hostages enough to bargain. Perhaps we can use them to force Joffrey's hand and retrieve my sisters. Or we might sway other houses to our side, if the Lannisters are truly crippled." Theon grinned faintly. "Aye, the realm is unsettled, and with your name on every tongue, the king in the North might well become the king of all if you play your pieces right." Robb laughed softly, a rueful sound. "I never wanted that. I wanted justice. I wanted to avenge my father, protect my family. But now, the pieces are in motion, and I must see it through." So they stood on that balcony, two young men shaped by a world at war, a direwolf at their feet, a conquered city beneath them, and the wide sea beyond. The dream of an unbreakable alliance with the Iron Islands shimmered like a mirage. They had taken the Westerlands by storm, forging a victory that would echo in every corner of the Seven Kingdoms. Yet the cost was uncertain, the path forward riddled with the perils of ambition, betrayal, and the unyielding tides of war. Even as the sun set, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink, Robb knew the darkness of night would soon follow. His heart felt heavy with the burdens of kingship. Theon, too, gazed out at the distant horizon, where Pike lay somewhere across the sea, beckoning him with a call he could never quite escape. In the morning, they would set new plans in motion, negotiations, entreaties to other houses, tidings of war that spread like ravens' wings. But for that single moment, they allowed themselves a brief respite, standing amid the spoils of their impossible triumph. No one could deny it now. The young wolf had become a conqueror. The Westerlands were at his feet, Lannisport and Casterly Rock his prizes. It was an astonishing turn of fate that left half the realm reeling. Yet in the shifting currents of power, one false step could drown even the mightiest. The next moves of this great game would decide whether the wolf and the kraken could truly shape Westeros to their will, or if all they had gained would come crashing down upon them in a tempest of blood and betrayal. And so the swords remained drawn, hearts steeled, eyes fixed on the horizon, where thunderclouds gathered and storms brewed anew, waiting, as they always did, to test the mettle of kings. Robb Stark did not sleep well in the nights following his victory at Casterly Rock. Darkness settled upon his soul each time he closed his eyes, as though the burdens of kingship had turned tangible in the hours past midnight. He was young, too young, he sometimes thought, for the weight of a crown, the intricacies of war, and the constant risk of betrayal. Yet the realm did not pause for his doubts. The realm demanded action, demanded more blood, demanded cunning. And so, each dawn, he rose to face the new day with solemn determination, reminding himself that his father's legacy pulsed in his veins, that all he did was for the honor of House Stark and the safety of the North. He took his morning meals in one of the grand chambers overlooking Lannisport's harbor. Though battered by siege and made uneasy by foreign occupation, the city retained its wealth and architectural splendor. White stone towers crowned the hillside, and along the docks, merchants quietly resumed their trade under the watchful eyes of Northmen and Ironborn. Smoke still lingered in certain neighborhoods, a grim reminder of the fighting that had consumed the streets. But bit by bit, the citizens tried to rebuild their routines. A city could not survive on fear alone. Gray Wind lay near Robb's chair as he ate, the direwolf's keen yellow eyes following each new figure who entered. Servants kept their distance, still fearful of the monstrous beast that had charged through their streets. But Robb, between bites of bread and sips of watered wine, would occasionally glance down to scratch Gray Wind behind the ears. That small gesture, so ordinary at Winterfell, felt incongruous in these foreign halls. One such morning, Roose Bolton arrived unannounced, slipping into Robb's presence like a living shadow. Bolton's pale eyes flickered over Gray Wind before he inclined his head in greeting. "My king," he said softly. "Apologies for the intrusion." Robb had learned to keep his composure around the Lord of the Dreadfort. He set his cup aside and regarded Bolton coolly. "Lord Bolton, I trust you bring news." "I do." Roose bowed again. "We've heard from our outriders. Tywin's survivors have rallied near the Gold Road, possibly fortifying a position in the hills to the east. Reports suggest he nurses his wound and has sent riders to King's Landing for reinforcements. It's said he may attempt to strike back, though it will take time for him to muster a new force. Also, ravens arrived from my son, Ramsay, and from your mother near the twins." Robb's lips tightened at the mention of Ramsay, whose reputation he despised. But in these times, every ally was needed, no matter how distasteful. "Speak on." Bolton produced a small scroll. "From Lady Catelyn. She is concerned about the Ironborn. Word spreads that Balon Greyjoy's reavers have struck several minor northern hamlets along the stony shore. She begs that we put pressure on our allies to cease these depredations. House Manderly threatens to close White Harbor's ports to all Ironborn vessels, perhaps even to ours, if they see us as complicit. The lords of the North do not sit idle while their lands burn." Robb felt anger stir in his chest. "How many times must I tell Theon and Victarion that such raids jeopardize everything we've built here? If Balon wants recognition as King of the Isles, I cannot grant that if he pillages my own people." Bolton's voice remained smooth. "A conundrum, indeed. Theon is caught between love for his father and loyalty to the Starks. It is said Balon uses that loyalty as a cudgel. Perhaps we should remind Theon that our alliance can be severed." Robb met Bolton's cold eyes. "That is a last resort. For now, I'll speak with Theon again. If diplomacy fails, I'll weigh other options." He pushed away from the table, standing so abruptly that Gray Wind lifted his head and sniffed the air. "Thank you, Lord Bolton. Unless there is more." Bolton pressed his lips thin. "Your mother also writes that she wishes to see you. Her letters are increasingly urgent. She must fear 1,000 devils, that something goes awry with our hold on the Westerlands, that Winterfell is vulnerable, that your sisters remain hostages in King's Landing. She begs you to consider negotiations for their release, and perhaps alliances with one of the Baratheon pretenders, if it hastens an end to this war." Robb nodded slowly. "I'll send her a raven, but for now my place is here." I won't relinquish my advantage in the west to chase uncertain bargains. The Lannisters are wounded, but not broken. We hold their gold mines if we can keep them. That must remain our priority." Bolton offered a slight bow. "As you command, my king." By midday, the keep bustled with the business of an occupied stronghold. Northmen patrolled the corridors, posted guard at crucial points, and escorted local lords seeking audiences with Robb or his council. Across the city, a contingent of Ironborn strutted with savage pride, wearing trophies from previous battles, boasting of the riches seized in Lannisport. The clash in temperament was striking. The Northmen, though hardened by war, carried themselves with a certain grim restraint, while the Ironborn Reavers lived as if each day might be their last feast. Fights occasionally broke out in taverns, usually begun by Ironborn who felt underpaid or bored with garrison duty. Theon Greyjoy moved between the two factions like a man trying to patch a leaky boat in a storm. Robb sometimes saw him in the courtyard, mediating arguments with a forced laugh, reminding both sides that they had seized legendary victories together. Yet Theon's forced gaiety could not mask the tension in his eyes. Whenever a raven arrived from Pike, Theon would look at the message with dread, as though it were a summons from an executioner. On the day Robb intended to confront him once again about the raids, Theon arrived in a small audience chamber unbidden. He had tidings from the Iron Islands, scrawled in thick, uneven letters across salt-stained parchment. Theon clutched it in one hand as he knelt, more ceremonially than wholeheartedly, before Robb. "I won't mince words," Theon said, rising after a moment. "My father's done with half measures. The Ironborn have begun raiding deeper into the north. Balon says the spoils belong to him by right of conquest, especially now that the North's main strength is in the Westerlands. He wonders who will stop him if we're all out here." Robb's wrath was immediate. "So he stabs me in the back while we hold the Lannisters at bay? Did we not pledge to respect the lands of each other? Did we not promise that the North would be safe from Ironborn aggression in exchange for acknowledging his sovereignty over the Isles?" Theon grimaced. "He does not see it that way. To him, you acknowledging his kingship is meaningless if he can't reave as he pleases. I've argued till I'm hoarse, but you know how my father can be. He wants to show the lords of the Isles that he's no man's puppet. He thinks to take advantage while your armies are far from home." Robb's hands curled into fists. Grey Wind, picking up on his master's rage, let out a low growl. The pair of guards in the chamber glanced at each other nervously. Robb did not hide his anger. "He forgets that I can sail for Pike once I'm done here. He forgets that I have a host large enough to burn those miserable rocks of his to ash." Theon swallowed, shoulders tense. "I can go there myself, Robb. Let me reason with him. Victarion still respects me enough to hear me out. Euron is absent, too interested in his own pursuits, so he won't be stirring the pot. I'll bring a strong message. If they continue these raids, they'll turn your banners, and your wrath, upon them." Robb drew a sharp breath, measuring Theon with a stony gaze. It was no small risk to let Theon depart. Once gone, Theon might rejoin his father wholeheartedly, or Balon could keep him as a weapon or hostage. But if Robb did nothing, the North would suffer. "Very well," he said at last. "I'll grant you safe passage and provide you with letters that reaffirm our alliance's terms. Make him understand that if he breaks them, if he continues these raids, he forfeits all gains we've won together. House Greyjoy will be our enemy once more, and we will crush him alongside the Lannisters." Theon exhaled slowly, nodding. "I will. Believe me, Robb, I don't want my father's stupidity to ruin what we've accomplished. But Ironborn do not think like us. They see reaving as glory, not as a moral failing. I can only hope my father sees reason in the threat of your retaliation." Robb signaled for parchment, ink, and quill. One of his aides hurried to fulfill the request. "I'll write the letter," he said, voice clipped. "You'll depart as soon as the tides allow. Victarion can manage the blockade while you're gone." Theon hesitated. "A small thing. Some of my men here in Lannisport, those who accompanied me, will they remain under your command while I'm gone?" "If you trust them," Robb replied. "Yes, if you doubt their loyalty, best to take them with you. I won't abide sabotage in my own lines." A flicker of regret crossed Theon's face. "I'll speak to them. Most of those who came with me are more open-minded about this alliance. They've tasted a share of the spoils. They don't want to lose it, so it was arranged." That very evening, a swift galley named the Seadrake, outfitted with both sails and oars, slipped from Lannisport's harbor. On board were Theon Greyjoy and a handful of loyal Ironborn, along with Robb's letter that spelled out the ultimatum. As the vessel crept through the moonlit waters, Robb watched from the ramparts, arms folded over his chest. Part of him still believed Theon might not return, but necessity overruled those doubts. If Theon could quell Balon's ambition, the North might be spared further bloodshed, and the alliance that had secured so many victories in the Westerlands could endure a while longer. After Theon's departure, life in the conquered city settled into a new routine of quiet tension. Northmen patrolled by day, Ironborn prowled by night, and the local populace went about its business under watchful eyes. The harbor master, once a stout supporter of the Lannisters, now answered to Robb's appointed commander. Merchant ships from the Sunset Sea were inspected carefully, levied a tax to fuel the war effort. Some foreign traders balked at these new policies, but with the Lannister navy in shambles, there was no real recourse. Victarion Greyjoy remained in the west, overseeing the blockade that starved Casterly Rock of reinforcements or supply. Occasionally, small Lannister vessels attempted to run the blockade, hoping to slip food or men into the fortress. Victarion's longships were relentless, intercepting nearly all attempts. The blockade was so thorough that no word emerged from the rock save for rumors carried by those who claimed to have fled. Some insisted that a few inside had turned to cannibalism, though such stories were likely exaggerated. Others whispered that Tywin himself had snuck back inside through hidden tunnels, but there was no proof of that. The men posted near the fortress seldom saw more than a glimmer of torches along its high ramparts or the distant shape of a gaunt lion banner fluttering in the wind. Within Casterly Rock's vast halls, Robb's garrison had taken care to keep the place under guard. It was not feasible to completely fill the fortress, given its labyrinthine size and myriad passages, but a rotating staff of Northmen and Ironborn patrolled key areas day and night. The small Lannister family members who had surrendered largely remained in carefully watched chambers, among them distant cousins, younger siblings, and uncles too old to fight. None carried the power of Tywin or the renown of Jaime, yet they were still valuable hostages, chits to be played in the larger game. Robb loathed using people as bargaining pieces, but the war had taught him harsh lessons. If he wanted to protect his sisters, if he wanted to keep the North united, every advantage was vital. As time wore on, a trickle of Western lords came to do homage, offering submission in exchange for lenient terms. One such arrival was Lady Cybele Spicer, mother by marriage to the craven Lord Stafford Lannister, who had died in a prior battle. She brought a paltry retinue to the gates of Casterly Rock one dusk, asking for mercy. Robb received her in the Rock's great hall, which the Northmen had tried to air out despite the lingering odor of old smoke and stale air. Cybele sank to her knee, tears glistening in her eyes, and begged for her family's sake. Robb found her pleas cloying, but he recalled how his father had taught him that good lords show compassion when they can. He granted her a measure of protection, demanding only her sworn oath not to conspire with Tywin or King's Landing, and a tax of gold from her estates to feed his armies. She left gratefully, muttering that the Starks were merciful conquerors. Such episodes won Robb a measure of grudging respect among the local populace. Here was a northern king who did not slaughter entire families, who did not tear down chapels or shrines, who permitted the Westermen to keep their ways so long as they acknowledged his overlordship. The Ironborn, of course, stirred fear wherever they went, but Robb had done his best to temper their worst impulses, threatening harsh punishments for looting beyond what was strictly necessary. Grumbles rose among the rank-and-file Ironborn, but with Victarion's presence and the knowledge that most of the real plunder came from seizing official Lannister shipments, they restrained themselves to a point. Nevertheless, tension coiled like a restless serpent in every corner of Lannisport. A day rarely passed without a stabbing or a brawl in the city's warrens. Rumors abounded that some rebellious pockets of Lannister loyalists were plotting sabotage. There were coded messages scratched on alley walls. Lions rising, wolves dying. Robb ordered additional patrols in the night, and the Great John led sweeps through the city's underbelly, dragging out would-be insurgents. Many of these saboteurs were little more than terrified tradesmen, but some carried real information, including details about Tywin's regrouping forces to the east. Interrogations gleaned that Tywin was forging alliances with lesser houses in the Reach, perhaps to secure passage or additional troops. The Tyrells, for their part, watched and waited, uncertain which side offered the sweeter deal. Meanwhile, the Great John chafed at inactivity. He marched through Lannisport streets with a half-dozen of his best men, lamenting that they had not done more to chase Tywin down. Sitting in a city while the Lannisters lurk beyond the horizon feels as though we're caged. He rumbled to Robb one afternoon. We're Northmen. We should be free in the field, hunting our enemies down, not roosting here like old hens. Robb understood the sentiment, yet strategic sense told him that chasing Tywin too far east might expose Lannisport to recapture or risk dividing his forces. Until word came from Riverrun or Moat Cailin that the north was safe, or that Tywin's new host was small enough to be smashed in open battle, the best move was to hold the city, the rock, and the gold mines that fueled the entire region. Let Tywin come to him if he dared. Still, Robb occasionally took small cavalry forays into the surrounding countryside to remind the local lords that the Wolf King was not idle. In these forays, the direwolf Grey Wind often ran ahead, scouting the terrain in ways that no normal hound could match. Sometimes, peasants cowered at the sight of the great beast. Sometimes, they approached tentatively, offering bread crusts or scraps in the hope of currying favor. Robb accepted their respect quietly, remembering how the North had suffered under the Iron Throne's rule. He resolved that if he truly was to be king, it must be a kingship that served the people, not simply replaced one tyrant with another. As the weeks unfolded, an unexpected visitor arrived at the gates of Lannisport, under a small white banner. It was Edmure Tully of Riverrun, who had managed to slip south and around the lingering Lannister patrols. He arrived with only a modest escort, dust-stained from the road, his eyes sunken with worry. Robb greeted him in the throne room of the old Lannisport keep, where Robb had established his seat of governance. "Cousin," Edmure said, embracing Robb briefly, "I've been too long absent. The Riverlands fare poorly under the weight of stray Lannister outriders and the threat of retribution from Harrenhal. My sister, your mother, grows desperate for your return." Robb guided him to a seat. "We've heard little from Harrenhal since Tywin left. Who commands the place now?" "Lord Peter Baelish was last rumored there, but truly no one is certain," Edmure replied, shrugging off his travel-worn cloak. "Some say it is a nest of sellswords who bow to whichever lord pays them. Others claim the mountain returned there after the defeat we handed him. It's chaos, Robb. The small folk suffer, and I can't hold the entire region alone. The Freys remain uncertain allies at best. And with you so far away, King's Landing might find a path to strike at us anew." Robb frowned. "I do not forget the Riverlands, but we've come too far to abandon what we have here. We hold Lannisport, Casterly Rock, and control the gold of the Westerlands. This is our greatest leverage. If I march back east, I might lose it all." Edmure nodded reluctantly. "I see the dilemma, but hear me out. What if we used the gold we've seized here to hire sellswords of our own, to bolster the Riverlord's defenses? We can't count on all those houses to remain steadfast. Some might be bribed by the Iron Throne. But if we pay for mercenaries, we can cover the Riverlands while you maintain your position in the west." Robb exchanged a look with the Great John, who stood by the dais. "It's a thought, but sellswords can be fickle. I'd rather rely on men whose honor I trust." The Great John let out a huff. "Sellswords have their uses if the coin is steady, my king. And we do have coin now." "That we do," Robb admitted. "And we can ill afford to watch the Riverlands slip away. The Lannisters might be battered, but if they ally with the Tyrells, or if King's Landing hires its own mercenary companies, we could be overwhelmed. All right, Edmure, draw up a plan. See who we might hire, what it will cost, and how we can coordinate them with your men. But be sure these companies have reason to stay loyal. I'll have no betrayal from within." Edmure stood. "Thank you, Robb. I'll handle it as best I can. In return, I also bring tidings that could concern you directly. There are rumors of parley from King's Landing. Some talk that Tyrion Lannister, newly freed from captivity in the capital, intends to open negotiations for a peace settlement. The Crown wants an end to the conflict in the West, or so they say." Robb snorted. "They're losing, so of course they want peace. Their fleet is decimated, their gold cut off. But I have my sisters to think of. If Tyrion truly wants to bargain for Sansa and Arya's release, I must at least hear him." Edmure's expression softened. "Yes, your mother would want that." The decision was made to dispatch a small delegation to a neutral site near the headwaters of the Blackwater, some miles east of the Westerlands. Roose Bolton volunteered to lead the negotiations. He was known for his measured demeanor, but Robb insisted he himself must also attend, if only to look Tyrion Lannister in the eye and judge the man's sincerity. It was a gamble, for Robb's presence away from Lannisport might invite trouble. But the potential prize was too great: the lives of Sansa and Arya, an official recognition of the North's independence, a formal cessation of hostilities. If King's Landing was prepared to admit defeat in the West, it would be a crowning triumph. Perhaps that might even persuade the Ironborn to scale back their raiding. Roose Bolton prepared the road ahead, selecting a vanguard of men as cold and efficient as himself. Robb chose also to bring the Great John, who bristled at the notion of diplomacy but agreed to protect his king if treachery arose. Thus, they rode out of Lannisport with a retinue of 100 cavalry, leaving behind a strong garrison. Victarion Greyjoy was informed that the Wolf King was leaving for a short time, and that if any trouble flared up, he would answer for it. Victarion simply nodded his thick neck and returned to drilling his sailors. They traveled through the rolling hills east of the city, passing hamlets that had already bowed to Robb's rule. Some farmers emerged from their fields to watch the royal party ride by, uncertain whether to cheer or hide. The dire wolf at the head of the column made for an intimidating sight, muzzle often stained with the dust of the road. Nights were spent in guarded camps, with sentries posted all around in case Tywin's men lurked. But they saw few signs of large Lannister forces, only the occasional burned-out farmstead or distant smoke from a bandit camp. At times, they encountered traveling merchants or hedge knights, who quickly recognized Robb and bowed in shaky awe. After nearly a fortnight's journey, they arrived at a wide clearing by a rocky stream, the place designated for the parley. Tall pine trees rose in a ring around the clearing, their boughs whispering in a wind that carried the scent of damp earth. On one side, a few tents bore the banners of King's Landing, the Lion of Lannister quartered with the Stag of Baratheon, though the stag's presence was overshadowed by the lion's dominance. On the other side, Robb's men pitched their own tents, raising the direwolf banner. Roose Bolton and the Great John personally surveyed the site, testing the ground for traps, but found nothing suspicious beyond a wary ring of gold-cloaked soldiers. Tyrion Lannister emerged from his tent at midday. Dressed in dark leathers embroidered with a golden lion, he walked with a purposeful stride. Though short of stature, he carried himself with dignity. A pair of gold cloaks hovered near him, but he waved them back with a casual flick of his hand. He approached Robb Stark, who stood with Grey Wind at his side, Bolton, and the Great John at his back. "King in the North," Tyrion said with the trace of a bow. "You've grown into quite the formidable figure since we last crossed paths. I suppose I owe you my compliments for the thorough success you've achieved in the Westerlands. My father is none too pleased." Robb regarded the dwarf coolly. "Your father started this war when he took my father's head in King's Landing." Tyrion sighed. "I won't deny your father was executed under Lannister auspices. That matter is beyond changing. But perhaps we can still salvage something from the wreckage. I come with an offer of peace of sorts." The Great John let out a low rumble, as though half a snarl. "Peace? Now that we have your precious gold and your western seat? You talk of peace." Tyrion's mismatched eyes flicked to the big Northman. I'm aware your position is strong, yet you do not hold the Iron Throne, nor do you have your sisters safe at your side. King Robb, my nephew, King Joffrey, as he styles himself, still rules in King's Landing, and your sisters remain wards there, especially your elder sister. My father once hoped to marry Sansa to my brother Jaime, or at least use her to keep the North in check. Times have changed, but she is still in the capital, along with little Arya. Robb inhaled sharply. He had not heard from Sansa or Arya in too long. The idea of them languishing in the Red Keep's clutches stoked a deep fury in him, but also a longing that threatened to compromise his better judgment. What do you propose? Tyrion spread his hands. An exchange of hostages. We propose to release your sisters, in exchange for certain Lannister kin you hold within Casterly Rock and Lannisport, my cousins, my aunt's line, and so forth. Moreover, a formal withdrawal of your forces from the Westerlands, returning them to the Riverlands or the North. In essence, you relinquish your hold on my father's seat, and in turn, the crown will acknowledge that the North is, well, let's say semi-autonomous. A cold laugh escaped Roose Bolton. Semi-autonomous. Pray tell, what does that mean to a man who calls himself king in the North? Tyrion's lips quirked. That is the point we must negotiate, of course. My father will never formally recognize another king in these 7 kingdoms, but perhaps a separate title, such as Warden of the North, with certain expanded privileges, could suffice to keep the peace. Furthermore, the Greyjoys must be disavowed. My father will not tolerate the squids ravaging our coastline. Indeed, if you withdraw your support from them, we can join forces to crush Balon Greyjoy. That would protect your northern coasts as well. Robb's jaw tightened. You come to me with an offer that demands I give up the Westerlands, my best leverage, and betray my ally. And in return, I get a half-promise about my own independence and the possible return of my sisters. That's not a deal, Tyrion. That's a beggar's bargain. Tyrion looked at him steadily. I realize it must not sound appealing, but it's an opening for conversation. You cannot hold the Westerlands forever, not while the entire realm is in chaos. Do you truly wish to rule over Lannisport as well as Winterfell, with the Greyjoys forever at your back, waiting to plunge a dagger into your throat? And let us not forget the Baratheon claimants, Stannis and Renly. One of them may soon make a move on King's Landing. If that happens, the entire realm might collapse into a war far worse than what we've already endured. Roose Bolton stroked his chin. Is King's Landing so afraid that you'd come here, personally, to broker such terms? You place yourself at risk. Tyrion gave a self-deprecating shrug. I've always had a penchant for risk. But in truth, King's Landing is less organized than you might guess. My father remains the real power behind the throne, but with the chaos in the West, many factions vie for influence. Cersei tries to reign in Joffrey's cruelty, Varys whispers counsel, and the Tyrells may soon intervene. I'm here because I'd rather the realm not drown in blood. If we can find a way to release your sisters, secure peace, and force those ironborn devils to retreat, perhaps we can avert a more terrible calamity. Robb considered Tyrion's words. He had no illusions about Tyrion's intentions. The dwarf was cunning and fiercely loyal to his family's interests, but he was also known to be more open-minded than most Lannisters. Will you swear to release my sisters immediately? If we can come to terms, Tyrion said. The moment we have a binding accord, I'll send ravens to King's Landing to free them. You'll have them escorted north, or wherever you wish. The Great John spat on the grass. We should cut off your head, little lion, and send it back to Joffrey in a box. Tyrion tensed, but forced a pleasant smile. I am under your protection by the rules of parley, my lord, unless you wish to shatter all illusions of honor. I expect better from the king in the north. Bolton's gaze lingered on Tyrion with a calculating glint. Such easy talk of illusions. A man might wonder why you place so much faith in them. Tyrion responded softly, because if we lose even illusions of honor, all that's left is chaos. Is that what you want? Robb lifted a hand to silence the bickering. I've heard your proposal, Lord Tyrion. It's not acceptable as is, but I am willing to continue talks. My demands. unconditional release of my sisters, immediate recognition of northern independence, and acceptance of my hold on the Westerlands at least until I am satisfied the Lannisters cannot strike back. As for the Greyjoys, I will not so easily betray the men who helped me take the rock. But if they break faith with me, that's another matter." Tyrion arched a brow. "That's quite a tall order. You must realize my father will balk. But let me bring these demands to him and see what can be done." And so the parley ended on an inconclusive note. Tyrion retreated to his tent, presumably to write hurried dispatches, while Robb and his companions withdrew to discuss in private. They camped there for 3 days, exchanging letters carried by neutral parties back and forth between Robb's and Tyrion's tents, haggling over every point. Tyrion tried to compromise by proposing that Robb retain the gold mines for a certain term, then withdraw, but that was not enough to guarantee the North's security. Tyrion insisted that the sisters could only be released once the Northmen were out of the Westerlands, which was unacceptable to Robb. Around and around the negotiations went, until tempers flared and threats were muttered. Throughout it all, Grey Wind prowled restlessly, sensing his master's agitation. The Great John had no patience for these games and spent much of his time sharpening his axe near the campfires, glowering at the Lannister party across the clearing. Roose Bolton, by contrast, thrived in the atmosphere of tension and compromise. He offered sly hints and subtle suggestions, backing Tyrion into corners with soft-spoken arguments. Still, Tyrion was no fool. He countered each maneuver with quick thinking, admitting when pressed, "I see that we share certain talents for persuasion, Lord Bolton." On the third night, an unexpected twist arrived. A small retinue bearing the sigil of House Tyrell, a golden rose, rode into the clearing under the same white banner of truce. They were led by Ser Loras Tyrell, the famed Knight of Flowers, accompanied by a tall older lord who introduced himself as Lord Mathis Rowan. Their presence changed the parley's dynamic significantly. Tyrion looked uneasy as the Tyrells dismounted. Robb frowned, wondering what new complication had emerged. Ser Loras approached Robb's tent with careful courtesy. "King in the north," he said, bowing more graciously than expected from a southern lord. "I come on behalf of King Renly Baratheon, who has formed an alliance with House Tyrell. We seek to bring peace to the realm, even if it means forging new agreements with you." Robb exchanged a glance with Bolton and the Great John. "Is Renly near?" "Near enough," Loras replied. "He and my father, Mace Tyrell, are not far from King's Landing with a significant host. But Renly has heard of your triumph in the Westerlands. He knows the Lannisters' power is waning. He wishes to propose a meeting of monarchs, the king in the north and King Renly. Together you might bend the Lannisters or the Iron Throne itself to your combined will. We have no reason to fight each other, after all." The Great John let out a booming laugh. "Another king wanting to court us. A year ago, none would have guessed the North would be so popular." Loras gave him a tight smile. "King Renly is a man of the people, I assure you. He understands that the 7 kingdoms need strong rulers, not a boy king propped up by Lannister gold. If your grace is willing to speak with him, we can arrange it." Robb felt the weight of decisions piling upon him. "We are in the midst of negotiations with Lord Tyrion Lannister. I assume you do not come as his ally." Loras's expression hardened. "He's no ally to Highgarden. My Lord Father grows impatient with Lannister arrogance. We'd prefer to see House Lannister removed from power, but we'd rather come to terms with you than engage in further bloodshed. A realm torn by multiple kings and armies can only lead to more suffering. There must be a compromise." Tyrion, who had wandered over with a handful of gold cloaks, offered a half-bow of greeting to Loras. "Ah, the Tyrells. I wondered when your petals would appear. Come to collect your debts, have you?" Loras ignored him. "My concern is with King Renly's ascension. We do not seek Joffrey's continued reign. My lady sister Marjorie is wed to Renly. She would be queen once the realm is stabilized. And we hope to find a resolution that does not leave the countryside in ashes." Robb pressed his lips together, scanning the faces before him. Tyrion, cunning and watchful. Loras, valiant and proud, but clearly playing the role of envoy for an ambitious king who had declared his own right to rule. The realm truly was fracturing beyond recognition. "Very well," Robb said at length. "I'll speak with King Renly if he sends me a formal invitation, but I will not relinquish what I've gained in the West. If Renly wants an alliance, he must respect the North's sovereignty." Tyrion let out a wry chuckle. "So many kings, so little time. I see my father's worst nightmare unfolding. But let it never be said that Tyrion Lannister could not navigate a labyrinth. Perhaps we can all find some middle ground, improbable as it might seem." The negotiations devolved into an ever more complicated web. Letters flew between Renly's camp, King's Landing, and Robb's entourage. Loras Tyrell promised to ride swiftly to Renly's side and organize a meeting. Tyrion awaited answers from his father, or from Cersei, or from whomever held the true power in the capital at any given hour. Robb weighed each new missive with an ever-increasing sense of frustration. He yearned to rescue his sisters, to secure the North's independence, to keep the Westerlands under his sway just long enough to guarantee Tywin's permanent defeat. Yet every side wanted something else, both from him and from each other. At length, Robb decided that continuing to linger in the pine-ringed clearing was pointless. He told Tyrion that if the Lannisters truly wished to continue discussions, they could send an envoy to Lannisport or the Rock. Tyrion found that notion dangerous, but Robb would not budge. "I hold the advantage, and I have no reason to chase the Lannisters across the realm for their convenience," he said. "My sisters remain in King's Landing. If you'd release them, perhaps that would move me to reconsider. Until then, come to me if you want more talks." A final round of courtesies was exchanged, each side distrustful, aware that no binding agreements had been reached. Tyrion parted with a crooked smile, his horse picking its way across the clearing. Ser Loras had left the previous day. The Great John muttered curses about the duplicity of southern lords, but Bolton only gave a half-shrug, as if to say that this was the dance of politics in wartime. Robb was prepared to mount his horse and return to Lannisport when a scout rode in, wide-eyed, breathless. "My king!" the scout blurted. "Word from the coast. A fleet of ironborn sails north. Victarion Greyjoy has parted from Lannisport, leaving behind only a token force. He claims he's needed in Pike, that the drowned god calls him home. The harbor is nearly empty now. Some of your men fear the Greyjoys might have abandoned the alliance." A spike of alarm shot through Robb. "When did this happen?" "Perhaps 4 days ago, your grace. The messages were delayed by the forest. The watchers say only a few longships remain under a minor captain." Victarion took the bulk of his force and sailed away without further explanation. Robb scowled. "And so the Kraken reveals its true nature. They must have heard that Balon is raiding the north. Victarion might be answering a summons, or he's decided we are no longer worth the trouble." Bolton's expression was unreadable. "Without the Iron Fleet, our stranglehold on the Westerlands is less certain. Still, we have enough men to hold Lannisport. But if Tywin returns with a new army, or if the Tyrells enter the field, we might be in jeopardy. We relied on the Ironborn to maintain our naval superiority." The Greyjohn's fists clenched. "We should have gutted the lot of them when we had the chance. Now we're stuck with half a victory, enemies all around." Robb felt the weight of it pressing on his heart. If Victarion's departure was any sign, then Theon might also have failed to rein in Balon's raids. The north was under threat. Winterfell could be besieged by Ironborn at any moment, if they truly sought to reclaim old conquests. He struggled to keep his voice level. "We ride back to Lannisport immediately. If the city remains under our control, we can regroup. I refuse to surrender what we've fought so hard to gain, but we must be ready for the next move." The journey back carried a new tension, as though every shadow in the hills concealed Lannister scouts or renegade Ironborn. Robb pressed the pace, feeling the pulse in his temples. Grey wind kept to the front, ears pricked, muzzle occasionally lifting to test the breeze. The Greyjohn's men rode with grim purpose, and Bolton's men with quiet vigilance. Days blurred, but at last, they reached the outskirts of Lannisport. To their relief, The city still flew the direwolf banner, though the ramparts were noticeably under-defended. Robb led his riders through the gates, which parted with a resounding groan. Inside, the streets showed signs of unrest. Fewer people moved about. Many shops were closed. Rumors spread like wildfire that the Ironborn had deserted the city and that Lannister forces would soon reclaim it. He found the garrison commander, a tall Karstark bannerman named Harrion Snow, near the keep. Harrion bowed hastily. "My king, it's true the Iron Fleet has gone. Victarion gave us hardly any warning. He seized half of the gold in the harbor warehouses, loaded it onto his ships, and sailed off, saying the drowned god had new battles for him. Only a handful of Ironborn remain, none above the rank of a deckhand. We tried to stop him, but..." Robb held up a hand. "You did what you could. Was there any bloodshed? Any sign of them turning on us?" Harrion shook his head. "No, my king. They left without attacking us. Seems they just left. We lost the crucial blockade, but they left the city intact. That's something." Robb forced his tone to remain even. "And Casterly Rock? Still ours, though the men there worry. If Lannisport is threatened, they are cut off. We have no naval power now. Tywin's men might attempt to retake these shores, or they might let us wither on the vine. We do still hold the mines, but some of the laborers have fled or hidden. Production is down, and the local lords sense our vulnerability." Robb nodded curtly. "I need to speak with all my principal bannermen and remaining allies in the city. We'll come up with a plan. The Great John, Lord Bolton, you'll join me." He paused. "Have there been any ravens from Theon Greyjoy?" Harrion grimaced. "None, your grace. A few from White Harbor, reporting more Ironborn raids in the northern coasts, but nothing from Theon." Robb felt a bleak sensation rising in his chest. Perhaps Theon's mission had failed. Perhaps Theon had discovered he could not control Balon at all. Or worse, perhaps Theon had fallen victim to his own father's manipulations. But there was no time to dwell on that. The situation in Lannisport was precarious. The illusions of strength the Alliance once held were fading rapidly, as though a bright flame guttered to embers. That evening, Robb convened a war council in the keep's main hall. Lords Karstark and Bolton attended, as did the Great John, Dacy Mormont, and several other Northmen of note. A small sprinkling of Westerland lords who had bent the knee appeared, looking nervous and uncertain. The hall felt emptier without the presence of Theon's rowdy Ironborn captains or the reassuring knowledge of a strong fleet anchored offshore. Robb stood at the head of the long table, gray wind at his side. Maps lay spread out, detailing the coastline, the roads east toward the Gold Road and the Riverlands, and the precarious routes heading north. Lanterns cast flickering shadows on the ancient walls. Outside, a stiff wind rattled the shutters, a herald of an autumn storm. "The Ironborn have abandoned us," Robb began, gazing at the Northmen assembled. "No doubt they sail to raid our coasts or fight some war of their own. Our hold on the Westerlands remains, but it grows more fragile. We still command the city, the rock, and the gold mines. Yet Tywin lurks east with the remnants of his force. King's Landing negotiates, but offers little. The Tyrells promise an alliance, but we do not fully trust them. The situation is changing by the day." Karstark drummed his fingers on the table. "If Tywin strikes, we must be ready. His supply lines may be short if the local lords rally to him. And our supply lines are as long as the distance back to the neck or what we can forage here. If the locals turn hostile, we risk being outnumbered." Dacy Mormont nodded. "We can't scatter ourselves defending every hamlet. Perhaps we fortify Lannisport, gather in the rock, and concentrate our strength. If Tywin wants to pry us out, let him break himself on our defenses." Bolton's pale eyes glittered. "A siege can be reversed, my lady. We would be the ones besieged if Tywin is cunning. And we have limited naval power now." The Great John pounded a fist on the table. "Are we truly to cower behind walls like frightened children? The wolves should be out in the field, biting at the lion's heels." Robb raised a hand for calm. "I understand the frustration, but we must be strategic. The Westerlands are rich, but they're also more populous than we realized. If the lords see a chance to rally behind Tywin, we could face an uprising throughout these lands. We need a show of strength, and soon. Bolton considered. Perhaps a demonstration of force. Strike a swift blow against a key fortress that still belongs to the Lannisters. One that, if taken, would leave Tywin no choice but to face us. We choose the ground of the battle. Meanwhile, we maintain a decent garrison here to prevent sabotage. Robb tapped a location on the map. Ashmark, seat of House Marbrand, near the Tumblestone. If we can seize Ashmark, that places us closer to the Riverlands and cuts off Tywin's route to the Gold Road. We lure him into a battle. If we defeat him again, the Westerlands might finally break for good. Karstark frowned. Battle is always risky, my king. All war is risk, Robb said quietly, remembering the countless men he had lost along the way. But the time for half measures is passing. If we're to keep the West and protect the North from Balon's treachery, we must ensure the Lannisters cannot reemerge as a threat. Once we've dealt with Tywin, we can turn our full attention to the Ironborn. The realm may quake, but we'll stand in control of our destiny. The council murmured. Most were reluctant but admitted there was little alternative. Remaining passive would only give Tywin time to gather reinforcements. Attempting to hold everything at once might also fail. So they settled on a plan. Robb would take the bulk of his fighting force east, march on Ashmark, and aim to secure the roads there. Meanwhile, a smaller group would remain to hold Lannisport and the Rock, led by Haryon Karstark. Dacy Mormont agreed to stay as well, to provide stout leadership in the city. The Great John, unstoppable in his hunger for battle, would ride with Robb. Bolton, ever the cunning presence, insisted on joining the main host, presumably to keep an eye on developments. Preparations were swift. Ravens were sent to allied or cowed Westerland lords, warning them to keep their peace or face the young wolf's fury. The mines near Casterly Rock were put under guard, with clear instructions to keep shipping gold to Lannisport in Robb's absence. He would need that wealth to pay for the war. The battered Lannister ships in the harbor were pressed into service as best they could, though none were as formidable as the Iron Fleet. Gaps in their naval defenses yawned wide, but there was no mending them now. The day the army departed Lannisport dawned gray and damp, a light drizzle spattering across the cobblestones. The Northmen assembled in the main square, ranks of mounted knights and foot soldiers alike, waiting for their king to lead them. Robb rode to the front, gray wind pacing alongside his horse, tail raised in a sign of alertness. On the ramparts above, local townsfolk and the remainder of the garrison watched in silence. Some might have felt relief that the occupying host was leaving. Others dread that Tywin's vengeance might soon descend upon them. The Great John raised a horn to his lips and blew a resonant note that echoed among the stone walls. The soldiers roared, brandishing spears and axes in the air. Robb nodded to Haryon Karstark, who saluted from atop the gatehouse, and then he spurred his horse forward, leading the column out of the city. The thunder of hooves and the shuffle of boots soon drowned out the gentle patter of rain. They marched east, determined to strike Ashmark and force Tywin into the open, to finish what they had begun. The traveling was grueling, the roads muddy from autumn's frequent rains. Progress was slow, with wagons carrying supplies sloshing through mire, and outriders constantly scouting for sign of Lannister troop movements. They found evidence of small cavalry patrols, but never a large presence. The land seemed subdued, as though waiting for winter. Abandoned farms dotted the roadside, barns half collapsed, fields gone to weed. Robb felt a pang of sorrow at the sight. War ravaged the land no matter which side claimed victory. In the evenings, the army made camp, ringed by pickets and wooden palisades where possible. Scouts brought in meager game, foraging to supplement the rations. Sometimes the Great John would lead a hunting party in the nearby woods, emerging hours later with a boar or a deer. On the third night, they encountered a group of refugees, small folk from a village that had been sacked. They pleaded for help, claiming men in Lannister colors had attacked them. Robb offered them what food he could spare, telling them to follow behind the army for safety. Their plight reminded him again of the cost borne by ordinary people. After nearly a fortnight, they approached Ashmark's outskirts. The seat of House Marbrand was not as imposing as Casterly Rock, but it was perched on a rocky rise, with a sturdy curtain wall and a swift-flowing river along one side. Smoke rose from the chimneys. Apparently, the castle was still occupied by Lannister loyalists. No banners flew from the ramparts, though. Either they hoped to conceal themselves, or they had run out of boldness. Robb called for a halt, sending forth scouts to gauge the defenses. Word soon came that the castle was indeed garrisoned by Lannister men, likely a few hundred strong, under the command of Ser Adam Marbrand, a veteran cavalry commander who had survived earlier battles against Robb. Ser Adam was no fool. He would see that the young wolf's host vastly outnumbered him, but with Tywin's support, he might attempt to hold the fortress until relief arrived. Robb considered an immediate siege, but the Great John pressed for a bolder approach. If we strike hard and fast, we can smash their gates before Tywin shows his face. Ser Adam's men must be demoralized. Show them the might of the North, and the castle could fall in days. Bolton spoke in his quiet way. That's a gamble. We might lose many men in a direct assault. On the other hand, a protracted siege gives Tywin time to gather a relief force. The victor in a war of speed often prevails. Robb weighed both counsel. He studied Ashmark's curtain walls from a distance, noting the condition of the gatehouse, the presence of archers on the ramparts. The fortress was formidable, but not unassailable. We'll attempt a swift siege, intensifying pressure with catapults and rams. If we breach the walls quickly, good. If not, we fall back on entrenchment. Either way, we must be prepared to face Tywin. Our scouts must watch every approach. I don't want him taking us unawares. So began the siege of Ashmark. The Northmen constructed siege engines from nearby timber, building crude rams and hastily assembled trebuchets under the direction of the Mormont engineers. Day after day, the battered fortress endured a barrage of stones, flaming pitch, and arrows. Ser Adam led sallies from the gates at night, trying to burn the siege engines, but the Great John was always ready. Furious skirmishes flared beneath the moonlight, swords clashing in the gloom. On more than one occasion, Grey Wind's savage howl signaled to the Northmen that a Lannister sortie was underway. As the siege wore on, Robb received troubling news. Outriders reported a substantial force moving along the Gold Road, bearing Lannister banners. Tywin, at last, was on the move, and with him marched a mixed host of Westermen bolstered by mercenaries rumored to be from across the narrow sea. The Watchers suspected the force numbered perhaps 15,000, less than Robb's army, but still large enough to threaten them. If Tywin reached Ashmark and coordinated an attack with the defenders, the resulting battle would be fierce. Yet even that was not the only concern. A separate raven arrived with grave tidings from the Neck. Balon Greyjoy's reavers had struck a blow at Torrens Square, capturing it in a surprise attack. House Tallheart had retreated to the countryside, and the Ironborn now held the stronghold. White Harbor was threatened, though House Manderly's forces had thus far kept the raiders from entering the port. Winterfell itself remained safe for the moment, with Bran Stark presiding under the guidance of Maester Luwin and Ser Roderick Castle. But the message made clear that the Ironborn menace was growing, that the North was in real peril. News of Balon's bold move spread through the camp, sowing disquiet among the men. Many asked how they could remain so far south while their families might be at risk. Some demanded that Robb lead them north at once to defend their homes. Others insisted that finishing the war with the Lannisters was the surest way to eventually free up forces. Bolton carefully fanned the flames of worry, remarking to a few that the alliance with the Ironborn had been a mistake from the start. The Great John, for once, agreed wholeheartedly, his face dark with anger. He wanted the entire might of the North to sail or march back and crush the Krakens once and for all. But retreat now, Robb reasoned, would mean surrendering the Westerlands to Tywin. All those men who had died conquering Lannisport and the Rock would have died in vain. Robb felt he could not do that, not yet. Instead, he sent urgent ravens to Lady Catelyn and Edmure Tully, begging them to assist the northern border if possible. He also wrote to Lady Manderley, assuring her that reinforcements would come. The tension weighed on him like a leaden cloak. Nightly, he dreamed of the ocean swallowing the north, waves topped with kraken banners, while lions roared in the distance, and a dire wolf stood alone on the shore. Still, the siege continued, relentless. On the 12th day of bombardment, Ashmark's outer wall partially collapsed under the pounding of a trebuchet stone, opening a breach near the southwestern tower. At dawn, Robb ordered an all-out assault through the rubble. The Great John led the charge, axes in hand, bellowing a war cry. Northmen poured into the breach, clashing with Lannister defenders in desperate melee. Smoke and dust churned through the courtyard, arrows hissed from arrow loops, and men fell screaming into the debris. Yet the attacking wave could not be stopped. Robb himself, sword in hand, scrambled over the broken stones, gray wind bounding beside him, scattering foes with snapping jaws. Inside the walls, the defenders put up a fierce resistance, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. Ser Adam Marbrand rallied his knights near the keep, only to be ambushed by a flanking party of Umber spearmen. Surrounded and bleeding from multiple wounds, Ser Adam tried to cut his way out, but the Great John tackled him from his horse in a thunderous collision. The Lannisport began throwing down arms, surrendering in clusters. When the dust settled, Ashmark was in stark hands, its gatehouse raised to display the direwolf banner. Robb's men cheered hoarsely, exhausted and blood-spattered, but triumphant. Robb took a moment to catch his breath in the ruined courtyard. Smoke drifted from fires set during the assault, and the moans of the wounded echoed off stone walls. Bodies littered the ground, Northmen and Lannisters alike. Gray wind licked blood from his muzzle, pacing restlessly among the debris. The Great John strode up, dragging the wounded Ser Adam by the collar. "Yielded," he announced, tossing Marbrand forward. The battered knight sagged to his knees, panting through a mouthful of blood. "I yield," Ser Adam wheezed. "You've got me. 7 hells, you're as relentless as they say, Stark." Robb eyed the man. "Where is Tywin?" "Coming," Adam managed. "With a host. Won't be more than a few days, if that. He'll not let you hold this castle uncontested." Robb nodded grimly. "Then we prepare. I'll have men tend your wounds, Ser Adam. If you try anything, you'll regret it." Ser Adam grimaced, perhaps feeling some relief at not having his head immediately parted from his shoulders. He was carried away by a pair of Northmen. The Great John leaned in to Robb. "Now we hold Ashmark, but Tywin's breathing down our necks. Is it wise to remain here?" Robb wiped sweat from his brow, surveying the castle's battered ramparts. "This fortress can serve as a defensive strongpoint. If Tywin wants it back, we'll make him pay. We'll position ourselves in the surrounding hills, use Ashmark's walls as a fallback. We can't allow him to pass us and strike at Lannisport without a fight. This is where we'll stand." And so they hurried to fortify their new prize. Men labored to clear rubble, to erect sharpened stakes, to set up vantage points along the broken walls. Scouts ranged out to track Tywin's movements. Meanwhile, the wounded were treated as best as possible, and provisions were gathered from the nearby farmland. The entire army prepared for the impending clash. Came sooner than expected. Within 3 days, outriders brought word that Tywin's vanguard was less than a league away, arrayed in columns bearing the lion banner. Robb ascended the newly patched walls, peering through a spyglass. Sure enough, the horizon shimmered with the dust of many horses, the glint of plate armor, and the red and gold of House Lannister. This was no minor skirmish force. Even from a distance, Robb guessed thousands marched under Tywin's command. The men near him stirred uneasily. They remembered the earlier battles, the cunning ambushes, the savage fighting. But this time, Tywin likely marched with renewed resolve, and perhaps fresh allies or sellswords bought with what gold had been secreted away before the mines fell. "Positions," Robb barked, handing the spyglass to an officer. "Signal the horns. Every man to his station." A flurry of activity swept through Ashmark's battered courtyard. Archers scrambled up ladders, cavalry readied for a sally if needed, foot soldiers lined the breaches in the walls. The Great John and Bolton stood at the southwestern parapet, each flanked by a dozen guards. Gray wind stalked back and forth, hackles bristling. The sun climbed high, revealing Tywin's army in terrible clarity. Formations of infantry in disciplined blocks, cavalry in the wings, siege engines rolling behind. Banners flew overhead: House Crakehall, House Lannister of course, House Brax, House Swift, and others. Even as they advanced, horns sounded, drums pounded. Robb recognized the methods of a general who had seen countless campaigns. Tywin intended to envelop Ashmark systematically, leaving no route for an easy breakout. The siege lines began to form before midday. A clarion call rang out from the Lannister ranks. A standard-bearer rode forth, accompanied by a single knight in shining armor. Ser Gregor Clegane, the mountain that rides. Gregor rode a warhorse nearly as massive as he was, scanning the walls with dark, violent eyes. The message was clear. There would be no gentle negotiations. Tywin had come for blood. From atop the walls, Robb watched as a smaller figure, likely a herald, approached within bow range, carrying a white flag. The herald shouted up at the defenders, voice carrying across the still air. "Hear ye the words of Tywin Lannister, Lord of Casterly Rock, Warden of the West, Shield of Lannisport. Surrender this fortress, return the gold you have stolen, and renounce your false kingship in exchange for clemency. Otherwise, none within these walls shall live." The Northmen responded with jeers and taunts. One man loosed an arrow that fell short, skittering on the ground near the herald's horse. No one believed for a moment that Tywin's clemency was genuine. Robb himself strode to the top of the gatehouse, meeting the herald's gaze from afar. "Go back to your lord," he called, "and tell him this. The king in the north does not surrender. Let him try his worst." A hush fell for a moment. Then the Lannister lines stirred in agitation. The herald turned and rode back. Ser Gregor snorted, tugged on his reins, and withdrew into the ranks. Robb's men readied themselves for the onslaught. War horns cried out from both sides, echoing in the valley. Siege towers began rumbling forward. Lines of infantry marched in disciplined step, and the thunderous beat of cavalry hooves rattled the earth. Above, the sky was gray and pregnant with the threat of rain, as though nature itself braced for the carnage to come. Robb drew his sword, raising it high in the air. "Archers, knock arrows," he roared. "On my mark, loose!" Along the ramparts, hundreds of bowstrings tightened, archers squinting at the advancing Lannisters. Robb waited until the enemy lines came into optimal range, close enough that the mass of red and gold uniforms filled the field before them. "Loose!" he bellowed. A dark cloud of arrows arced overhead, descending with lethal accuracy into the tightly packed ranks. Cries went up as men fell, thrashing in the mud. The Lannisters pressed on regardless, stepping over their dead, raising shields overhead. Drums beat faster, the horns keened. Within minutes, the first wave slammed into Ashmark's walls. Ladders rose, hooking over the broken battlements, and Lannister foot soldiers scrambled up, brandishing swords and spears. Northmen thrust downward with pikes, some tipping ladders over to send men plunging to their deaths. A fierce melee erupted at the southwestern breach, where rubble allowed an easier climb. The Great John waded in with a savage grin, swinging his axe with both hands, hacking aside any who dared challenge him. Robb joined that fight briefly, gray wind at his side, tearing out the throat of a captain who tried to flank them. Yet it became clear that this was only the opening gambit. Farther back, Tywin's siege engines rumbled into position, catapults armed with heavy stones. Bolton, observing from a tower, shouted that more columns of Lannister cavalry were circling to the north, possibly seeking a way to surround the fortress. Robb realized with grim clarity that Tywin meant to pound Ashmark to rubble, or break it by encirclement, whichever came first. Hours bled into a maelstrom of violence. The Lannisters repeatedly tried to scale the walls or break the gates, each assault turning the ground below into a tangle of corpses and shattered timber. The defenders repelled them with stones, boiling oil, arrows, anything at hand. The battered fortress seemed to hold, though every new barrage of catapult fire loosened more of its old masonry. Near midday, a sudden swirl of horns on the western flank signaled a cavalry charge. The Great John and a small mounted force within the fortress had managed to open a sally port in the curtain wall, bursting out to harry the Lannisters' exposed siege crews. The Great John's fierce war cries echoed across the field. For a moment, they wreaked havoc among the catapults, setting some ablaze, scattering engineers. But Tywin responded swiftly, unleashing his own cavalry wing led by Gregor Clegane. The clash of steel roared across the plain. Robb, watching from the parapets, clenched his fists in anxiety. From this distance, he could not distinguish friend from foe, only swarms of riders colliding in a swirling melee. At last, the Great John's battered cavalry returned through the sally port, chased by Lannister riders who almost managed to force their way in. Bolton directed crossbowmen to cover the retreat, bolts punching through horseflesh and men alike. Gregor Clegane loomed on the periphery, hacking down a pair of Northmen who lagged too far behind. The Great John, face streaked with blood, swung the portcullis closed just in time, cursing the mountain with every breath. It was a small victory, some catapults destroyed, but the fortress defenders had paid a price. Tywin Lannister's lines reformed, encircling Ashmark more completely. Drums pounded again, and fresh infantry columns prepared for another push. The day was far from done, and the Northmen fought for every inch of wall. Robb found himself moving from one threatened section to another, rallying archers, directing reinforcements. Grey Wind's presence heartened the defenders, who still believed the young wolf capable of miracles. But each minute taxed the fortress's crumbling ramparts and the men's waning strength. Late in the afternoon, a torrential rain began to fall, as though the heavens themselves wept for the carnage below. Water drenched the defenders, turning the walls slick with mud and blood. Arrows lost some of their range, but so did the catapults. Lightning forked across the sky, thunder shaking the air. The Lannisters paused their mass assaults, perhaps wary of the storms, but maintained their siege lines. From the heights of the keep, Robb gazed upon a field strewn with corpses, illuminated briefly by each lightning flash. He could see Tywin's command tent in the distance, lit from within, presumably where the old lion planned his next move. As night descended, the fighting eased, giving way to a grim stalemate. The fortress still belonged to Robb, but its walls were battered and dangerously undermined in places. The Lannisters had lost hundreds, maybe thousands, yet Tywin's army still outnumbered the defenders. A second day's assault might be unstoppable. Meanwhile, the Northmen were exhausted, wounded, and uncertain. Many whispered that they could not withstand another full-scale assault. Robb called a council of war within the keep, around a sputtering brazier that barely dispelled the cold and damp. The Great John, battered and bruised, leaned against a table. Bolton stood with hands folded, eyes glittering with unreadable thoughts. Others pressed around them. Captains, banner officers, men caked with mud. "We can't hold forever," the Great John admitted, spitting blood. "One more push like that and these walls crumble. My men are ready to die if we must, but it's a tough death with no guaranteed gain." Bolton spoke softly, his voice carrying in the hush. "Tywin is cunning. He'll wait for dawn, then smash us to pieces unless we have a trick up our sleeve. We could attempt a breakout under cover of night, slip away before they realize." Robb shook his head, hair plastered to his forehead by rain and sweat. "We didn't come all this way to flee. If we give up Ashmark, the Westerlands revert to Lannister control." A tall captain from House Glover coughed. "Better that than losing our entire force here, my king. If we're annihilated, the North is left defenseless." Silence fell as each man grappled with the painful truth. Robb stared at the battered walls, listening to the rain drum on the rooftop. He recalled the vow he made to secure the North's safety, to avenge his father, to free his sisters. Was he about to let it all slip away? Or was a strategic withdrawal the only way to preserve the men he had left? Then, A new voice echoed from the corridor. "Sire, riders approach. They're carrying torches and a banner we don't recognize." Heads jerked up. Robb sent men to look from the battlements, curiosity mingling with dread. Who would dare ride through Tywin's siege lines at night, in a raging storm? Before long, a sodden scout returned with a wild tale. The riders bore a banner showing a sunburst. They claimed to be envoys from King Renly, come to aid the king in the north. Robb blinked, exchanging glances with Bolton and the Great John. Could it be some cunning trick of Tywin's? Or a sign that Renly Baratheon had decided to intervene? The possibility of a Tyrell-backed force was not unthinkable. If the Tyrells saw an advantage in crippling the Lannisters, they might have marched swiftly, slipping behind Tywin's lines, or perhaps forging some route from the south. Robb gave orders for the gates to open cautiously. Guards with crossbows lined the passage, ready for treachery. Through the rain-swept darkness, a column of perhaps 100 horsemen emerged, each bearing a flaming torch. Their cloaks were soaked, but the frontmost rider lifted a standard displaying a golden rose entwined with the stag of Baratheon. Another bore the device Robb did not immediately recognize, a golden circle with multiple rays, as if a stylized sun. Behind them rode armored men wearing half-cloaks of deep green. Their leader was a tall, bearded knight with a grim expression. He dismounted in the courtyard, water streaming off his helmet. "We come as allies," he declared, "under orders from King Renly Baratheon and Lord Mace Tyrell. We bring tidings of a joint campaign against the Lannisters." Robb and his closest captains arrived, swords drawn but lowered. Grey wind bared his teeth, uncertain. The visitors did not flinch from the direwolf, though they eyed him warily. The bearded knight bowed. "I am Ser Colin of Greenpool, sworn to House Tyrell. We come bearing a message. Renly Baratheon has mustered an army in the Reach and moves north to corner Tywin Lannister. We had hoped to arrive before the siege began, but the roads were treacherous. Now we stand willing to coordinate with you to catch Tywin between two forces. He cannot withstand both the north and the Reach, not in these battered Westerlands." Robb's heart pounded. This could be the decisive stroke he needed. Where is Renly now? Marching along the Mander. If you hold Ashmark for another day, perhaps two, we will be upon Tywin from the south. Our outriders are already harassing his supply lines. Victory is assured, if you can keep him pinned here. The Greatjon's grin returned, a savage curve across his bruised face. "So we trapped the lion between wolf and stag?" Bolton inclined his head in thought. If these men speak truly, it could shift the balance. Tywin's lines would collapse if cut off from behind. But are we certain this is not a ruse? Ser Colin drew a parchment from within his soaked cloak. "Here, a letter from King Renly, stamped with his seal." He handed it over. Robb examined the wax seal, an emerald stag crowning a rose, and recognized the Tyrell motto scrawled as well, "Growing strong." The words inside beckoned him to stand fast, promising imminent relief, urging that together they could end Lannister power in the west. It carried Renly's flamboyant style, speaking of feasts and glories to come once they triumphed. A flicker of hope kindled in Robb's chest. This was the break he needed. If the Tyrells and the loyalists to Renly attacked Tywin from the south, Tywin's siege lines around Ashmark could be thrown into chaos, allowing Robb to sally forth and strike. The Lannisters, pinned in the middle, might well be destroyed. That would effectively break their last major field army. With Tywin gone, and the west truly overrun, perhaps King's Landing would capitulate or crumble. Then he could address Balon Greyjoy with full might. He turned to Bolton, voice hushed. "It's a risk. We must trust that Renly truly is near. If we hold here and the Tyrells fail to arrive, we'll be overrun." Bolton's face was impassive. "We've endured the day's onslaught. We can endure another if we're lucky. But many good men will die." Robb's jaw set. "Then so be it. I will not abandon the best chance we've had to end this war. We'll hold Ashmark one more day. Let Tywin break himself upon our walls. If Renly arrives as promised, we'll slam shut the trap." The Great John laughed through broken lips. The lion won't know what hit him. Ser Colin bowed again. We'll reinforce your defenses tonight, if you'll have us. My men are at your disposal, King in the North. Robb nodded, a surge of determination coursing through him. Welcome, then, to Ashmark. Find what shelter you can. We'll need every blade when dawn comes. May the gods be with us all. And so, amidst the thunder and the rain, the gates closed upon these unlikely southern allies. The battered fortress roused itself for another day of savage battle. In the flickering torchlight, Robb read and reread Renly's letter, imagining the day when Tywin's lines would break under the combined might of the North and the Reach. If that day came, the Lannisters' era of power might truly be at an end. The horizon was dark, the storms fierce, but for the first time in months, Robb Stark felt a genuine glimmer of hope that victory, and with it, the North's salvation, lay within his grasp. Night deepened. Men snatched brief moments of rest in the gatehouse or behind the splintered parapets. The Tyrell riders mingled with the Northmen, setting up makeshift tents under what little cover they could find, speaking of how Highgarden mobilized tens of thousands. Some half-joked about the feasts that would follow the defeat of Tywin. Others muttered more somberly that war rarely ends so tidily. Robb stood upon the ramparts, letting the cool rain run down his face, stroking gray winds-soaked fur. A distant flash of lightning lit the siege lines below, glinting off the Lannister armor. Tywin's men were huddled around campfires, no doubt cursing the weather and forming plans for the morning assault. If only they knew what might come from behind. If only Renly was as near as his letter proclaimed. Doubt gnawed at Robb's mind. The Tyrells had their own ambitions. Renly sought the Iron Throne. Could he be trusted once Tywin was crushed? But Robb pushed the thought aside. First, they needed to defeat the Lannisters. Then, negotiations over titles and crowns could resume. The future was unwritten, precarious, but in that precariousness was also the promise of greatness. He gripped the hilt of his sword, hearing the faint sizzle of rain on steel, and silently pledged that no matter how events unfolded, he would see the North safe or die in the attempt. Dawn came at last, a grim, pale light seeping through the storm clouds. The Lannisters assembled once more, drums beating a steady rhythm that set the men's hearts pounding. Robb's force scrambled to position, ignoring their aches and wounds. Alongside them stood the Tyrell riders, eager to prove their mettle. Horns shrieked as Tywin unleashed a renewed assault, columns of infantry charging the breaches, while catapults hurled stones at weakened sections of the walls. The defenders held desperately, fighting hand to hand where the walls had crumbled. Rain-slicked stone turned the courtyard into a killing ground. Screams mingled with the clash of steel, men slipping and sliding in the mud. Bodies piled around the gates. Gregor Clegane was sighted smashing into the southwestern tower, cutting men in half with savage sweeps of his greatsword. Roose Bolton's archers poured arrow fire into the cluster around him, but the mountain shrugged of wounds like a beast possessed. On the northern flank, the Great John bellowed for more reinforcements, as Lannister knights poured through a battered gatehouse. The line threatened to buckle. Still, the defenders endured, guided by Robb's presence. Gray wind leapt at any foe who crossed his path, rending them with feral intensity. The Tyrell riders dismounted to fight on foot, using spears to push back Lannister pikes. Their shining green and gold surcoats quickly grew stained with blood and rain. Above, lightning flared again, illuminating the carnage. It was a scene from the darkest tales of war, a swirling maelstrom of mud, blood, and thunder. Then, in the distance, across the field that stretched behind Tywin's lines, came a faint rumble. Horns, clarions, the crash of metal. At first, few noticed, lost in the chaos. But as the minutes passed, the roar grew, echoing over the farmland. Robb, locked in combat atop the ramparts, took a moment to glance behind Tywin's army. He saw confusion rippling through the Lannister ranks. Officers looked frantically southward. Some men began to break off from the assault to face a new threat. Suddenly, banners of deep green and gold blossomed on the horizon, along with the crowned stag of Baratheon and the golden rose of Tyrell. Renly's host had arrived, smashing into Tywin's rearguard with a thunderous cavalry charge. At the forefront, Robb glimpsed knights in resplendent armor. Perhaps Loras Tyrell himself led them, or some other Tyrell bannermen. The effect was immediate. Tywin's carefully ordered lines buckled under the surprise assault. Shouts and screams carried across the battlefield as the Lannisters found themselves attacked from behind. Sensing the shift, Robb raised his sword high and roared, "Now! Counterattack!" The Great John bellowed in agreement, spurring the Northmen to surge forward out of the gates, smashing into the disoriented Lannister soldiers who had been pressing the siege. Bolton's men joined, cutting down archers who tried to flee. The Tyrell riders inside the fortress also poured out, forging a corridor of death. Trapped between two enemies, Tywin's lines collapsed into chaos. One by one, the siege engines fell silent. The Lannisters were surrounded, their flanks pinned. Gregor Clegane attempted to rally a contingent of knights, carving a path of slaughter toward the southwestern fields. Yet a wave of Tyrell cavalry thundered in, forcing him to retreat or be encircled. The mountain roared in frustration, leading a breakout with a handful of survivors. Elsewhere, the Red Lion of Castamere banner was seen shredded amid the mud, signifying a lesser ally of Tywin broken. Horses screamed, men died in droves, and the ring tightened around the Lannister heart of the formation. Robb pressed forward, gray wind at his side, through the swirling combat. Rain lashed his face, but he advanced relentlessly. He wanted Tywin Lannister himself, wanted to end the old lion's threat once and for all. Cutting through a tangle of men, he glimpsed Tywin's golden armor in the distance, near a collapsed catapult. The old man was shouting commands, trying to form a wedge of his personal guard. Robb urged his horse onward, ignoring the pain in his shoulder from an earlier slash. But Tywin, seeing the day was lost, had no intention of falling there. With practiced discipline, his guard protected him, hacking aside any who came close. Horn signals blared, indicating a retreat. Tywin and a corps of remaining knights fought their way free of the encirclement, spurring their mounts into a gallop that carried them to the wooded hills. Renly's cavalry gave chase, but the terrain favored Tywin's escape. Soon, the bulk of the Lannister host lay in ruin, with scattered remnants fleeing in every direction. As the battle subsided, the combined North Tyrell forces converged on the battered fields around Ashmark. Bodies lay thick in the mud, the stench of death overpowering. Rain continued to pound from the heavens, turning the ground to churned gore. Knights pulled off helmets, gasping for breath. Horses stamped and kicked at the remains. Robb found the Great John supporting a wounded Bolton, who had taken an arrow in the thigh. Bolton's face was pale, but he was still conscious, cursing softly at his misfortune. Meanwhile, from the southern approach came a new cavalry wedge, bright banners of green and gold fluttering. At their head rode King Renly Baratheon himself, clad in ornate armor featuring a golden stag, antlers curved around his helm. Beside him trotted Marjorie Tyrell on a dappled mare, wearing a cloak of shimmering green despite the storm. Highgarden lords fanned out around them, forming a protective escort. Renly surveyed the carnage, then turned his horse toward Robb. He lifted his visor, revealing a handsome face, dark hair plastered to his brow. "King in the north," he called, voice resonant over the din. "We have made quite a mess of the Lannisters today." Robb, splattered in mud and blood, inclined his head. "We are grateful for your timely arrival, King Renly. It seems we share a common foe." Renly guided his horse closer. Up close, Robb saw the excitement glittering in Renly's eyes. A man who relished the pageantry of war yet had not truly tasted its bitterness, or so it seemed. "Indeed," Renly said. "We parted ways with them near the Mander, outmaneuvered their outriders, and struck as soon as we learned you were under siege. Tywin has fled, but his army is in shambles. The West is yours, and ours, for the taking." A faint smile touched Robb's lips, though exhaustion weighed heavily on him. "So it seems. We owe you a debt, King Renly. Marjorie Tyrell's gaze flicked across the carnage. The realm owes a debt to each who stands against Lannister tyranny. Let us not dwell on who owes whom just yet. Instead, let us see to the wounded and ensure Tywin does not rally another day. Renly nodded, turning to call for his bannermen to begin clearing the field. Trumpeters sent out signals that the battle was over. Northmen embraced Tyrell knights in ragged camaraderie, while roving squads gathered prisoners. The smell of wet ashes and blood hung thick in the air. Robb felt a surge of relief and a flash of renewed ambition. With Tywin's forces broken, the lion's roar was but a feeble snarl. Lannisport and Casterly Rock were secure, the gold mines firmly in Stark hands. Now, with Renly and the Tyrells as potential allies, a new chapter in the war opened. If they combined their might, perhaps King's Landing itself would fall. And then Robb might free his sisters and truly secure the North. The specter of Balon Greyjoy still loomed, but at least the Lannister threat was greatly diminished. Standing in the rain with Grey Wind panting at his side, Robb gazed upon Renly's retinue. He saw in them the pomp and color of the South, so different from the cold practicality of the North. Could they truly forge a lasting partnership? Or would they become rivals for the Iron Throne once the Lannisters were done? He pushed the question aside for now. Let the future unfold as it must. At that moment, they had achieved a monumental victory, one that might shape the fate of the Seven Kingdoms. The battered fortress of Ashmark bore witness to the improbable union of wolf and stag, and rose against the lion, with the Kraken's betrayal looming somewhere far to the north. In the swirling mists of war, alliances rose and fell like ocean tides. But today, at least, belonged to the king in the north and his new allies. Amid the wreckage, that single truth shone bright as the last vestiges of daylight pierced the storm clouds overhead. And so, as men cheered and wept and the crows gathered, Robb Stark stood tall in triumph, uncertain of what storms awaited but resolute in his claim and his purpose. To protect his family, his kingdom, and all he held dear, no matter the cost.